introduce you to a close friend of mine and author of several Bartram books. The latest one he published is called Travels on the St. Johns River, and somebody's got a copy of it. Wave it at me. Yeah. So Dick France is our second speaker, and Thomas Halleck's our first speaker. This book was just published and ready for consumption, I guess in January or so, right? And our friendly local bookstore has them on the shelf right now. They're going to be open until we're done here, and that's on St. John's Avenue. So if you go out here, turn left, go to the corner of 6th Street and St. John's Avenue, they've got them for you. Okay? My friend Thomas Halleck's here, and I can't tell you all about him, other than he's the worst fisherman I've ever fished.
Sam has really done an amazing job, and the whole Palatka crew, Putnam County, and coming from an outsider, it's some of the best.
After him all the time.
I know. It's some of the best meeting of just scholarship and history and culture and art and environment that one sees anywhere. What do we know about William Bartram? Who knows something about William Bartram? Oh, yes, him back. Here, tell us what you know about William Bartram. Oh, fantastic. Yes, he was. Give her a round of applause. There you go. Born in 1739 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. What else do we know about Bartram? There's people here. Yes?
He was a twin. He had a twin sister.
He had a twin sister named Elizabeth, and she lived over in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Yeah. Actually, there was a pretty full Bartram brood. There were 2 rounds of them. What else do we know about Bartram? Yes? Yes, Native American people, the Creek called him Puckpuggy. He got that name when he was in Gainesville, I guess south of Gainesville, on the Alachua Savannah. Means flower gatherer. What else do we know? Yeah, anything else?
Well, he was a Quaker, but fought in the Revolutionary War. Yes, I know.
Sort of borderline, touched in the American Revolution, did kind of, so definitely signed a loyalty oath to the United States, and got more and more Quakerly the older he got, actually. And I think one of the things that really makes him special is that his theology, his religion, fuels his view of Native people, fuels his view of the natural world, really approaches nature with a sense of humility and openness. I think of the idea of listening to nature comes really from the best of the Quaker religion, listening to people and trying to reach peaceful understanding with the world. Yeah. What else? Yes?
He was a perfectionist artist, but he was a lousy plantation.
I always joke that Benjamin Franklin could not get him a job. He was born in 1739. He studied under the great Charles Thompson, who's a kind of hidden figure from history, signer of Declaration of Independence. Went to the Pennsylvania Academy, which is the forerunner of the University of Pennsylvania. He tried doing this. He tried doing that. In the 1760s, he was a trader. And then what happened is that after the 7 Years or French-Indian War, Florida became part of what was then the British Empire. A little quick backstory. The British took Cuba during the 7 years of French-Indian War, and then in exchange for Havana and Cuba, the British said, here, you can have Florida. So Florida was kind of the consolation prize. With that, there was a wave of paper speculation, indigo, and people started running plantations. And William Bartram came down here with his father after the French-Indian War and botanized, but they were also kind of sussing out the land for speculation, for use, for that kind of economic transformation. He stayed in 1765, 66. He was not a particularly good planter. But the thing about that is that he began to evolve as an artist in the 1760s. He had always been a drawer. Drawing and botany are his darling delights, it was said of him. But he couldn't really find a career. And then sort of bounced around through the 1760s. In 1773, he got the call from John Fothergill to explore the Southeast. Wandered around the Southeast for 4 years, touched into 8 present-day states, Brad? 7, 8? Yeah, we're debating Tennessee. I don't know if Tennessee... no. All right. Came back in 1777. Now, came back to Philadelphia in 1777 to the family business. They were all horticulturalists. They were plantsmen, as they called it. Why would 1777 have been a bad year to come back for a business in Philadelphia? Yeah, the American Revolution pretty much shut off the plant trade between not only England and the U.S., but pretty much Europe and the Americas. So he was out of work from 1777 to 83. Now, in 1783, he was up there in a cypress tree, right? And fell out of the cypress tree, broke his leg, and he did what a lot of people did at that time, and that is he turned to natural history as a kind of work of recovery. And we don't know this for sure. People we're sort of speculating, but that's when he drafted the book called Travels. And from there, it wasn't published until 1791. So we have a 7 or 8 year tape delay between the first manuscript and the final version. And how many have read Travels? All right. Oh, wow. Round of applause. Yeah, those of you that know, I'm teaching my son to drive right now. And he's actually very good, but he's learning on a stick, like we all should. We should all learn how to drive. And as you know, if you've ever driven with someone learn how to drive like a stick, it's yeah, a lot of some of you. That's how I liken reading Travels, because you'll be going along poetry, then bam, all of a sudden you're getting into really technical scientific description, or you're getting into Latin. That only maybe professionally trained scientists can even know or understand in 18th century botany, and all of a sudden you feel like you stop. Well, the reason why is that he drafted this spiritual autobiography in the 1780s while recovering probably from the broken leg, and then later the scientific information was tipped in, either by him or it was kind of boilerplate scientific language. So sometimes when you read the book and it feels like it jumps quickly, that's why. It was published in 1791, and even though it was blasted in the press for its treatment, its outlandish portrayal of alligators, for it was overly sympathetic to Native Americans, people believed, even then Bartram had toned it down a little bit. And probably because his sponsors, his supporters were mainly from the Episcopal circles in Philadelphia. And so he had to take some of the more radical elements and some of the more radical Quakerism and pull it down just a notch. Then the book went out into the great wide world. It was really seen as one of the first works of Romanticism on either side of the Atlantic, and today we follow it. Now, what else? Anything else about William Bartram? Yes?
He was asked to go with Lewis and Clark on their expedition.
Yes, although he was pretty old by that point, right? I mean, he was born in what year was he born again? What's that? Yeah, he was born in 1739, and the Lewis and Clark expedition was 1804 to 1806. That would have been a little old to be going out there. But he did remain active through the rest of his life, both as an artist and as a botanist. First, from the 1780s through the early 19th century, he ran a successful garden. That's one of the misconceptions we have about Bartram, that he was kind of like a little bit of a ne'er-do-well, a little bit of a flake. He was actually a good businessman with when he turned to horticultural pursuits. And we lose sight of that, but part of the British, French, American plant exchange, and then also the garden became the unofficial lab for the University of Pennsylvania. So his friend Benjamin Smith Barton, with whom he collaborated quite a bit, professor of natural history and materia medica, used to take his students over to Bartram's gardens. Really, really great reading. There are a whole bunch of medical theses that Bartram provided the engravings for. Some of my favorites, experimentations with botanic cures, very, very, they're almost comic because they're talking about what their dosage is, and then, no, this didn't work. But he remained active really up until the 1880s. I'm sorry, the 18 teens. So here's a drawing he did of the limpkin, all right, the Tantalus ephosica in 1818. Here, we'll get a shot for the... But think about it. He started in the 1750s drawing, and then he finished in the 1818s. So that's the 50s to the 60s, 60s to the 70s, 70s to the 80s, 80s to 90s to the aughts. That's 6 decades active professionally. That's a pretty remarkable career. Much longer than anyone thinks. So how do we read travels, and what do we make of William Bartram? I think we always have to think of him in terms of between the practical and the romantic. We always think of him in terms of the economic and the poetic. And so he did set up his own plantation. I remember I was sitting in Philadelphia transcribing letters. I spent about 10 years of my life transcribing everything he wrote. And I came across this letter from John Bartram to William in 1765. And John was sending supplies to William for his plantation down at Piccolata Creek. Dean, where are you? Dean, where's Piccolata Creek? Explain it to us. All right. Okay. And it's funny, when you read documents, when you transcribe documents, you begin to feel like you know that person. And when I read this letter from John sending supplies as well as slaves, there's plenty of cross-outs, there's plenty of insertions. You can almost see the father saying, this is just not a good idea. And it did not. John wrote, I have shipped on board the East Florida Captain Bishop 6 likely Negroes called Jack, a lusty man, a new Negro, 5'8", his wife Sibby, a new 5'1", Jacob, 5 foot high, 7, Sam, 4'7", also Flora, a lusty woman, not so black as Coromantee, and then also good millstones, half a dozen sickles, hooks, a bar of lead, make slugs for guns. When you read these passages, you realize that Bartram really was part of this plantation system that was going in Florida. But at the same time, amidst that, he would also familiarize himself with the botany, familiarize himself with the natural world, and you can see his growth as an artist. One of my favorite letters from the same period is by Benjamin Rush. I don't know if anyone's read it. It's available in this book, which is at our local bookstore. And all proceeds to the book, I should, by the way, mention, go to the Bartram Trail Conference, so please get one. But he describes the Ixea, Bartram's Ixea, the celestial Ixea. Every species or variety of the tribe of plants exhibits very eminent beauties, but this with applause claims the preeminence. Its elegant form of growth, with the brilliant coloring of its flowers, strikes on the imagination delight, and one can't look but with admiration. Here he is describing the Ixea in the field. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly where he saw it. The flowers open in the morning soon after the day breaketh, whose petals appear as a transparent film framed with singular beauty, consisting of a number of longitudinal fibers, which take their rise from the bottom, departing from each other gradually to near the middle, when they divide. thus again to the end, and are so minute, preventing altogether an appearance of the finest webby membrane, of so tender and delicate an excellence, they are bruised and ruffled by the gentlest breaths of wind, and no sooner than the slightest glance of the sunbeams pass over them than they disappear. The acres of ground were partly covered in such manner as to cast a glowing purple around, so after the sun is above the horizon, it would be almost impossible to find a flower, and one would be apt to conjecture all the beauty seen this moment to be mere delusion. Beautiful. It's one of my beautiful things. Has anyone seen an Ixea in the wild, by the way? Do we have any? Yes? Okay, so you are an early riser. Yes, the Ixea, to see the Ixea, you really do have to be there before sunrise. But Bartram is describing something so ephemeral. You have to see it in the field. You also have to see it not only scientifically, but you have to see it with your heart and with a sense of the beauty of nature. And I think there's something kind of remarkable that we need to hold on to, that we understand things not just poetically, but we understand things scientifically and technically. So maybe we could think about William Bartram in that way, as both the scientific Bartram, but also the poetic Bartram, as both the practical Bartram and the Quaker Bartram, all right, the spiritual Bartram. Let's think of those two sides. That leads to, for instance, where Bartram's travel starts. Sam talks about the prayer. Where are you, Sam? All right. When Bartram wrote his draft of travels in the 1780s, he started pretty much about at Lake George and almost had it as a spiritual autobiography. So midway through travels, he has a kind of opening. Ye vigilant and faithful servants of the Most High, ye who worship the Creator, morning, noon, and eve in simplicity of heart, I haste to join in the universal anthem. My heart and voice, my heart and voice unite with yours in sincere homage to the great Creator, the universal Sovereign. Oh, may I be permitted to approach the throne of mercy. May these my humble and penitent supplications, amidst the universal shouts of homage from thy creatures, meet thy acceptance. So Bartram is approaching nature almost, well, in a kind of spiritual way, and then again, with travels, later add in the scientific. So please hold that in your mind as you read Bartram, not just the technical, but also the Quaker. It makes it a really, really difficult book in a lot of ways, and it makes it a complicated book. It makes it tough to wrap your brain around, because Bartram is always shifting gears. And one of the things that we're trying, bless you, one of the things that Dick and I were trying to do when we prepared this volume, is we want folks to not only have a field guide, an understanding of William Bartram in Florida, but we wanted people to begin to look at travels in an increasingly complicated way. I wanted to give folks lots of different angles. The thing about Bartram is you have to read him almost like you're peeling back an onion. You keep coming back to him. And when you're reading, when you come back to the book again and again, you find it gets more complicated. So Bartram passes his own plantation at Piccolata Creek, all right, in Travels. And there's an interesting thing. How much does he say about his plantation in Travels? Nothing. There's nothing there. And so what I want people to do I hope you do pick up this book, and one of the things I'd like you to do is find the different spots where he describes the same thing twice, and look for the contradictions, look for the trapdoors, look for the lacuna, look for the holes, look for where Bartram is sort of going back on himself. And I think it makes it a much more human book. He's talking about the ephemera. Solemnly and slowly more onward to the river's shore, the rustling clouds of ephemera. How awful the procession! Innumerable millions of winged beings, voluntary verging on to destruction, to the brink of the grave, where they beheld bands of their enemies with wide open jaws, ready to receive them. But as if insensible in their danger, gay and tranquil, each meets his beloved mate in the still air, inimitably bedecked in their new nuptial roses. What eye can trace them in their varied wanton amorous chases, bounding and fluttering on the odoriferous air? With what peace, love, joy do they end in their last moments of existence? So it's a fascinating thing that Bartram is there passing the place where he had his plantation. It was a failure, where his father sent him the half dozen slaves, and there he is describing the mayflies. So what I would like you to do, what I would challenge us all as readers, is try and look for these disconnects. Try and look for these points where the pieces don't add up. And that, I think, is where the magic is, where you can't always fit things together. And he's trying to say, I think the point is that we're trying to understand the world at different levels. We're embracing the contradictions. And I think that makes Bartram much more human. That's about all I have to say for now, so I'll be happy to do. I have questions. Do we want to do now? Yes?
What was his relationship with George III? I mean, it says he was his botanist, but he was an American.
His father was made, he did not have a relationship with George III. His father, John Bartram, born in 1699, died in 1777, was made botanist to King George III and was given a modest stipend, and that is what allowed John and William to travel up the St. John's River.
But they were both loyalists.
Well, John was dead. John died in 1777, and then William was with the Patriot side, although kind of 30% Patriot. How about that?
He ends up in Georgia, apparently, in a small battle that had taken
Yeah, at the St. Mary's River, part of the defense.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think really the biggest effect of the American Revolution also was closing down his garden for 7 years, but then also his garden served as a meeting spot, an informal meeting spot for several people especially during the Constitutional Convention. Yes? Yes?
Is it definitive which spring ended up in the Coleridge poem, Kublai Khan?
Yes, that would be Salt Spring, and there are a couple of passages from Salt Spring that went into Kublai Khan. And again, that is something that's probably gotten a little bit more billing than it deserves. You know, if you talk to any poet, a poet friend of mine said, I read the phone book for inspiration. but yes, that Bartram I think even more Bartram was an influence on Chateaubriand and then Henry David Thoreau. But really, I think the beginnings of the literary essay, the beginning of the nature essay in the United States comes through Bartram. Sam, are we done? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
I retired from UF 9 years ago, and I was sort of floundering around trying to figure out, well, what's next? And so I took an organic gardening class here in Palatka, and at that point, the teachers took us over to Waterworks, which is near Ravine Gardens. And while they were demonstrating the lasagna technique for a humus pile, I was looking around thinking, well, this would be a cool place for an organic garden, a community garden. And at that point, I got a hold of the folks that were involved in this piece of land, and we started an organic garden. So that was my introduction to Palatka. I had the choice of volunteering in Gainesville, which I had been working in Gainesville for 40 years. I decided, don't want to do that anymore. So I started coming to Palatka. And the rest of the story is Waterworks, Bartram, and the River Center, and it goes on. So I sort of become obsessive about things like that. But anyway, and then I met Sam and got involved in the Bartram committee, and you are seeing now what can happen when you get somebody like Sam cracking the whip. We all jump when he cracks the whip, and he's amazing. He's an absolutely incredible individual, and he is responsible for all the things that are happening with Bartram in the St. John's area. So what I would like to do today is to continue what where Tom left off and sort of give you the science part of it, which is what I've done all my life. I was at the Florida Museum since 1970, and mostly I was a herpetologist chasing turtles and alligators and crocodiles and things of that sort. But then when I retired, I decided, well, I'm over here in Palatka. The flowers are really neat along Route 100 there. I live in Putnam Hall. And I started spending more time watching the flowers in the roadside ditch than my wife really appreciated. And so she started driving Mr. Daisy to Palatka so I could look at all the flowers. And then the obsession began with Bartram and his flowers. So today's talk is about Bartram and his flowers. Okay, so one of the really neat things that happened to me, I'm from Maryland, from Baltimore, and my brother-in-law and sister and I went up to the Bartram Gardens, and that's what this is. It's an incredible place. And in the parking lot of the Bartram Gardens, that's Philadelphia right there, and it's on the Schuylkill River, and it's real close to the International Airport, Philadelphia International Airport. So if you ever get up there, it's an amazing place to wander around. And this is Bartram's house. John Bartram built this house of, I think, fieldstone. And you can go tour the inside. I just want to let you know, we all know about Bartram's plants and his flowers. This is one of the unique plants that he has in his repertoire. This is the Franklin tree. And he found it on the banks of the Altamaha River and near what was then Fort Barrington. Apparently that was where the trail cut through Georgia and headed south. And this plant he found growing on some of the sandy lands, I think on the south side of the river. This is about 14 miles, I believe, upstream from Darien. He collected seeds, he collected plants, he took them back with him to Pennsylvania, planted them and so on. The last time this plant was found in the wild was in 1804 and it has not been seen since. It's in the nursery business and you can still buy them. I bought one and I have it growing on my place. Steve Chrisman, who's a herpetologist up in Quincy, he's got them growing in his yard, but they're absolutely beautiful. And what do they look close to? The loblolly magnolia, or the loblolly bay, excuse me. Both of them belong to the tea family, and they're both related. This tends to be growing higher up on the slope than the loblolly bay, which tends to get their feet wet. So it's really a cool plant. They have them at the Bartram Garden in Philadelphia. If you get up there, take a look at them. Or if you know somebody in the Carolinas, there are a lot of them in the Carolinas that have been planted. It's really a neat thing to see. But Bartram was an incredible artist. Think about this. He's in a boat, an open boat with a sail on the St. John's River for months. Still, he has a way of protecting his drawings. That's an amazing thing in itself. So anyway, it's a fascinating story. Just wanted to show you a couple things. This is a drawing that was made of William Bartram, and it was published in Harper's Magazine, I think, in 1870. And that's the way I picture him. This is a picture of of the house that John built. And John was a Quaker, but he didn't have the same ideas that all Quakers did. And you can correct me, Brad and Tom, but he sort of got kicked out of Quakerhood, but he still went every week in their face kind of thing. And the problem was that he believed in God, but he did not believe in Jesus as God. And so that went against the dogma, and so he got busted. And he there's an inscription on the lintel above that window that says, "It's God alone, Almighty Lord, the Holy One, by me adored." And so that sort of was his finger. Okay, so as Tom said, John made one trip to Florida in 1765-66. He picked up his son from Wilmington, North Carolina, and brought him with him. He was getting in trouble with his uncle at his uncle's house, and so they came here. The mural on the left was a mural that was in City Hall. It's been moved from the annex at City Hall, and I think it's now over in the Board of Education. But this is where is it? Airport. But it's an incredible, I think, visual of John coming in from his boat and being greeted here in Palatka by the Indians, the Seminole Indians that were living here. And then just sort of to contrast that, this is at the Fort Gates Ferry on the St. Johns River. My car, that's Melanie pulling us along with the rope. I don't think so. But anyway, it continues to hold a fascination to a lot of people, including me. Oops. Okay, just some views along the St. Johns River. It's an incredible place to wander. And thanks to Jim and Carol and their little boat, I've had the privilege of wandering the river with them. That's Stokes Landing. We're coming in towards Stokes Landing right there from the water. So I wanted to show you some of the animal life and plant life that Bartram saw, observed, and in many cases illustrated. You'll notice that photograph there is this guy right here. And as far as I can tell, it's a bluegill. The lower picture, I'm trying to become also a watercolorist in my old age. And so that's my bluegill in amongst the roots of the St. Johns River. But the important thing is that the river is full of life. The pistia, which Bartram called pistia, or water lettuce, is a native. A lot of people think it is introduced, but it is native. There are fossil seeds of this plant at Vero Beach. What's the age of Vero Beach? Million?
It's at least terminal place to see.
Yeah. So a long time before people had.
12,000.
Yeah, 12,000. Okay, and it also, the pollen has been picked up at Lake Annie by the paleobotanists that were drilling down into the sediments. So it is native, contrary to what you read. And then Nufar, which is the Spatterdock, which is a yellow water lily that basically coats the edges of the St. Johns River. So these are, when I think of the St. Johns River, I think of these kinds of images. Okay, along the edges of the St. Johns River, this is near Dreyton Island, Bartram found this plant, and that's his illustration of the Scarlet Hibiscus. And he writes, there are some rich swamps on the shores of the island, Dreyton, and these verge on the outside of large marshes, covered entirely with tall grasses, rushes, and herbaceous plants. Herbaceous means they're not woody. The most stately of all these herbaceous plants grows 10 to 12 feet high. These branches are embellished with large, expanded crimson flowers. You know, going back to Tom's comments about how his words and his illustrations really capture for many of us, including me, this sense of being on the St. Johns River. Remember, they were on the St. Johns River. There were Indians living along the river. There were a few plantations, but it was pretty vacant. And they had no maps. They had no ice chest full of cold beer. So think about that as it relates to all the things that you hear today, and think about with Bartram. They were here in a very primitive condition. When John and William Bartram first visited the first trip, they stopped off at Salt Springs. And William was wandering around Salt Springs, and lo and behold, he found these shrubs, these sort of evergreen shrubs growing, and they had this really weird flower, yellow flower. When they crushed the leaves, that smells like anise. This plant was not known to science until William stumbled upon it when he was wandering around Salt Springs. The only places this plant lives today is at Salt Springs and a couple of other small springs on the west side of Lake George. So this is a Bartram plant specialist. He found these things, and unfortunately, many of his names did not survive the millennias, mainly because a fellow in South Carolina came along ahead of him before he got around to finishing his treatise in 1791, Thomas Walter, and he described all these species from South Carolina, but not this one. Okay, this is another one of Bartram's neat plants. This is his illustration of American lotus. They still occur along the St. Johns River now. They're also in Lake Santa Fe. I've seen them in Lake Santa Fe. There's a little lake up here south of Lake City. That's where these pictures were taken. So it's a very prominent, beautiful plant and has that very unique seed pod. Another plant that you find growing along the St. Johns River are another couple of plants, the string lily or the crinum lily and the spider lilies. These pictures are taken along the Ocklawaha River, but he describes them in Travels. Another set of plants that also grow along the river, but a little further in from the water edge, is the cardinal flower, which is poisonous, by the way. It's a lobelia. It's a beautiful thing. It's a hummingbird pollinated creature, and lizard tail. They both tend to grow back into the wet forest. Bartram found rain lilies growing just west of Deep Creek. Now, Deep Creek has been now partially covered up with Rodman Reservoir. But if you go south out of Interlachen, you'll go down in a dip. There's a beautiful little creek there. It's the only place in Peninsula Florida where the white cedar is native to. He found the rain lilies over there on the left, the rain lilies there. This is another plant that he describes, the wild petunia, and this is almost a weed, but it tends to grow in moist forest. And I threw the Indian pipes in because that's such a cool plant. And I was on the trail with, I think, Jim and Carol, maybe Sandy and Jack, and we found them growing near the tower, the smoke tower, the fire tower, walking down to, there's a little sulfur spring there, and it was growing along the edge of the path. It's a plant that doesn't have chlorophyll. It gets its nourishment from feeding on a fungus or a series of fungi that grow associated with the roots of trees. So it's a saprophyte. And this is the only one I've ever seen in Florida. Up in Maryland, I'd find them in the woods all the time. But so I just threw that in. Such a gorgeous little plant. And it's a flowering plant. Those nodding things are the actual flowers. Over on that side, you'll see Bartram's Tarflower. That's Tarflower there. It secretes a resin. The petals do, the buds do, some of the stems do, and they catch insects. Now, I'm not sure what they do with the insects, but they do catch insects. And back in the olden days, people used to hang this up to take care of flies, catch flies in their houses. The other plant is the flower of the salt palmetto. And here's a wonderful story that's, I don't think it's published yet. It's coming out of the Archibald Biological Station. They have, you've seen palmetto that have these long, big stems, and they sort of come up out of ground, grow 6, 8 feet tall. Well, what one of their scientists did was to map out the underground parts of that, took samples from it, did carbon dating on those samples. They're finding out those stems could be as many as 3,000 or 4,000 years old. Wow. So something we have a tendency to think about as a piece of crap that gets in the way of our lawns. Some of those plants could be as much as 10,000 years old. And here is Bartram's Ixea that Tom was talking about. I think that based on what I see in the descriptions, he found this near Lake Dexter, which is near Lake Monroe, which we'll hear more about. But anyway, it's an absolutely beautiful plant. It grows in moist to wet flatwoods that have been recently burned. These came from up near Green Cove Springs. There's a patch of them there in that St. John's Water Management District property on the south side of the road as you're getting ready to go over the Shands Bridge. Shands Bridge. Anyway, that's where these photographs were taken. That's Bartram's illustration of it. And this is what you find when you see them. If you find one, you find the whole area filled up with them. They only bloom for a couple of hours early in the morning, and then they're gone. And the plant itself is so diminutive that you would not even know it's there until it flowers. And then when it flowers, these are flowers about like that big around. They're gorgeous. And they're dependent on fire that has come into the flatwoods. One of my favorite plants, and I've been pondering these plants for quite a while now, and Bartram described all three of these plants. The top one, the maroon one, is a dwarf pawpaw, or pygmy pawpaw as Bartram called it. The plant to the right that's sort of off the screen there is a woolly pawpaw, and he described it from Rawlstown. This is the one you find in all the cattle pastures in this part of Florida, and they grow as separate plants, but they're scattered around. They're really close together, and I've tried digging some of them up. They're all connected. So when you get a field of those things growing, I think they represent one or just very few actual plants. They're sort of like aspen, where a whole hillside will have aspen trees, but they're all the same specimen. They're just, anyway. And then finally, the one in the lower left is the, I don't know, I can think of, is the scientific name. It's the, what did I say? Big flowered pawpaw. Anyway, the differences between the woolly pawpaw and the big flowered pawpaw is the big flower blooms after it gets its leaves, whereas the woolly pawpaw gets its flowers first and then gets its leaves. And if you want to see the big flowered pawpaw, go over into Ocala National Forest, take the Fort Gates Ferry Road, and yeah, there we go. There's the pawpaw.
So
and
which is which, Nick? This is the...
I think that's the woolly, and that's the big flowered. And it turns out that he describes these things from what I think would have been the town of Rodman today. And in fact, all three of those species now currently occur in that little upland where the town of Rodman sits. The pygmy is very delicate leaf things. The other two get fairly large leaves. The big flowered pawpaw gets about this tall. They're beautiful plants, and you all probably at one time or another recited the pawpaw song. But that pawpaw is one that grows up north and gets really big fruits. These get small fruits, but gopher tortoises love them, foxes love them, and certain herpetologists go over and peck at them too. And then this plant, Bob Bird showed me this plant, and Bob is one of these wanderers on all the trails in North Florida, and he was wandering a trail along where the Santa Fe Swamp is, and growing all along the margins of that trail, it's a fire lane, is this thing. And I had never seen this in the wild. He took me there and said, look, it's right here. But anyway, this is a Kalmia. Now, what other plant do you know of that's Kalmia that you would know instantly? Mountain laurel, right. That's a Kalmia. If you look at those flowers, they look like mountain laurel flowers. But this thing only grows as a low shrub and has very small leaves, and they're hairy. Hence the scientific name hirsuta, meaning haired. And the mountain laurel is not haired. But Bartram saw this all along the St. Johns River. And the common name is, okay, forgive me, Lord. The common name of this is hairy Wicky. So I went on the internet to look it up, and they have a hairy Wicky there, a hairy angel Wicky, and she ain't a plant. So anyway, that was sort of a shock. Okay, now if you want to come and visit Bartram's Green Empire, there's a book actually, a children's book or an adolescent book called, was it? Darn thing. Anyway, it's a child's book, and it's called Bartram's Green Empire. And so if you want to come and sample some of Bartram's Green Empire, I would suggest you come to Waterworks. Now, Waterworks, we established this about 7 or 8 years ago as in its present form. It was set up earlier than that, thanks to Sandy Coker-Newt and some other folks. But Waterworks, we're really alive and doing things, and we're trying to show Bartram plants and Bartram's Green Empire, okay? And this is right next to Ravine Gardens. We're trying to not only plant things and restore things, we're also trying to interpret things. And my wife, Melanie, over here is a graphic designer, artist. I know you're shaking your head no, but got to live up to your past at some point. Anyway, she helps me with developing kiosks for out there. And this is one that we just recently completed on the St. Johns River wetlands. This piece of property, we bring, in fact, every kid in Putnam County comes to us during the course of a year, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades. And we have guided tours. We expose them to sticky things like smilex and swamps. And so this is, we also are open for visitation too. It's unfortunately right now we're all volunteers, so our visitation is pretty limited. It's Wednesday mornings and the first Sunday of the month. and love to have you come over. The problem is we don't have enough volunteers to keep us open longer than that. But anyway, we're developing these kiosks as interpretive information for visitors. What is happening there is one of the projects is restoring the wetland. This piece of property was originally the old water supply for Palatka. And when the town burned down in 1884, it rebuilt. That's where all the brick buildings came along after it was part of the rebuild, and this water works was set up at that time to have a domestic water supply piped to Palatka so that people had something, water in their homes, and also in case a fire got started, they would have some way of putting it out. And that's the old pump house there in the lower left. There's water that comes into the property from Ravine Gardens. It's spring water out of several steephead streams. And then this water was held in these various ponds back in the olden days. And what we're trying to do now is to create some kind of natural setting within these sort of cultivated areas. The top is meant to be a fishing pond. We want to have fish in the pond for parents and their kids to go fishing. There is an area off as we come down. As you look down the path here on the left-hand side, we're turning that into a marsh. We have this channel of water that carries water, and it all goes under the railroad track and out onto the St. John's floodplain and into the St. John's River. Another thing we're trying to do is, we're restoring the wetlands, so we'll have examples of wetlands. We also have some uplands on the property. And so we wanted, one of the big stories that we tell the visitors is about water supply, water production, and conserving water, okay? And so what could be more of an example of how natural systems conserve water, but a sandhill. All right, sandhills are the ones with the longleaf pine, the wiregrass, there'll be turkey oak in those habitats, and it's one of the richest, botanically richest habitats we have in Florida. Dave Hall and I did a study on some UF property near Melrose, and we found 350 species in our sandhills on that property. And many of them are found no other place but in that habitat. So what we decided to do with this property, this soil is the same soil we have at Ordway. It's candler soil. So we've been building, we put this barrier around about a half acre. We've introduced gopher tortoises to that property, and we've introduced so far about 50 species of sandhill plants. What they all have in common is they have their own ways of conserving water, and that's the message that we're trying to convey. The wiregrass that's growing in there, the tufts that you see, they have a fibrous root system. Any water falling from the sky onto the surface, they suck up. Some of them have roots that go down really deep and to a more permanent water supply. So all the plants have ways of conserving water. The gopher tortoise does the same thing. It gets most of its water supply from the food that it eats. They have a unique bladder system that stores water, and they will use that stored water during drought times. A gopher tortoise is a unique turtle. It's a tortoise. It's native to this part of Florida, and it feeds on these sandhill plants. There's a friend of mine, Ray Ashton, over in Gainesville, who has some property, and he's been looking at gopher tortoises for years, and he felt that in his sandhill, his wife is a botanist, and they're eating certain plants, and they're self-medicating. In other words, if they're not feeling up to par, well, if we go over here and munch on this, I'll feel better. So there is some a good reason for us to have this diversity of plants. So we have a lot of different plants for the tortoises to feed on. We have 3 tortoises that we got from the Game Commission. These are waif tortoises, meaning they came out of a program where they used to euthanize these turtles because they didn't know where they came from. This is the 3 we have came out of a house in Orlando. When the guy died, his daughter went into the house to clean out. They found 27 tortoises. So anyway, there are stories. Come see us at Waterworks. And there's just one other thing, I think. Well, Bartram described this, by the way. And he described it from a tortoise that he saw over in Alachua County. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was we have an... I need to have Melanie sitting right here. Anyway, we have an organic garden, community garden, and we have about 15 plots, and we have members from the Palatka community who get these plots and they grow vegetables. So anyway, thank you very much, and come to Waterworks sometime.
Is Irv Whitmire. Irv and I have been buddies for decades. He's at the Florida Museum and is a zooarchaeologist and studies shell middens that we have along the river. He's interested in things that show up in human habitations.
Real honor to be among natural historians, citizen scientists, and artists as well. I think National Science Foundation would like this, Dick. They would like it a lot. Yeah. This is the title of my talk. It's called Life on the Lake, Archaic Period 5,600 years before present, Hunter, Fisher, Gatherers of Lake Monroe, Outlet Midden. I would like to acknowledge my institution at the Florida Museum of Natural History. And this is where I have practiced zooarchaeology for the last 40 years. This is also your museum as well. It's the largest museum that is south of Washington, D.C. And if you pay taxes, that sort of thing, this is your museum. And so I invite you to come and take a look if you have not already done so. Zooarchaeology. Now, zooarchaeology may be a foreign term to some of you. However, if you've read about the domestication of dogs, if you've read about anthropogenic change of the planet, if you've heard about sea level rise and how it affects the environment, then you know our work. This is the sort of thing that we do. Zooarchaeology is the wedding of zoology and archaeology, where we seek to understand the human and natural history of archaeological sites through the identification and quantification of animal remains. One of the nice things about my job is that I actually have students. These students, I hope I'm not offending, but these students are from the University of Georgia. We also maintain comparative collections, and so these are the known skeletal remains of animals that have been collected from various situations. Those skeletons are used to identify the archaeological materials. And so if you'll see here on the top are little piles of bones where we've had those students picking at them and sorting them into logical units. Now, I have to tell you, I do not know anything about the skunk ape. News people have been asking me about it, but I do not know about this animal. It's St. Johns River Valley is a little out of its range, but that's just that. I'm more interested in hunter, fisher, gatherers. And so these are the people that worldwide have dumped their trash along the coastal areas of the world. They've dumped it along the lakes and the streams. and the St. Johns River is no different. Some of my colleagues refer to these places as shell-bearing deposits. However, if you'll notice, I've got a little sign there that says bone layer, and there's kind of that pink stuff. Well, in that shell section that you're looking at that's well over 2 meters deep at Cache Mound in Charlotte Harbor, that's a bone layer, and that's nothing but catfish bones in there. So these places are no more shell-bearing than they are bone-bearing or artifact-bearing. And they're important places for cultural studies and biological studies. The oldest shell middens date to 160,000 years BP at Pinnacle Point, South Africa. It has that nice golf course on the top of it. So change does happen. Some shell middens will have these ephemeral, not very diverse animals, number of animals in them, while they'll also have structure. And here's a shell ring that dates to 4,800 BP on St. Catherine's Island. There's 2 of them here, and we think that this may have been a living area. And you can see that that's almost 60 meters across if you kind of give it a measure. Shell middens are also these very large sections, and they can be deposited in fairly quick order. That section there, 2 meters deep, less than 200 years, so it doesn't take long. There is also a ritual component to shells, and so these graves that you see at Shiloh Cemetery, those are capped with hard clams, Mercenaria campuchiensis. The one thing that we know from our studies is that each fragment of bone or shell contains a record of human adaptations to an ever-changing environment. Shell middens are non-renewable resources, and that's an important thing to remember because these represent an archive of paleo-environmental information as well as prehistory. So for my talk today, I go to the consummate observer, William Bartram. And so I'm going to ask the question, and I'll answer this at the end of this. What did Bartram see? But I also am very interested in what did Bartram not see? And so we'll talk a little about that. I want to read this section to you. In mid-May 1774, traders went ahead with goods to the upper store at present-day Astor. Bartram followed in his small boat, passing Mount Hope. And he says here that this was it's a large shell midden that was named by my father and now demolished for road fill. Bartram mentioned that British residents had converted older Spanish orange groves into large indigo plantations. At Mount Royal, which is Fruit Cove, the party spent the night with a former Indian trader, Mr. Keene. On Lake George, they camped at the south end of Dreyton Island near the remains of a large mound and Grand Avenue. The thing that Bartram saw here, and I'm going to repeat this toward the end of this in my conclusions, but Bartram was looking at a landscape that 5,000 years before he had come on the scene and made his transit down the St. Johns River had irreparably been changed by Native Americans building their shell middens. So he actually camped on them. He saw them, he experienced them. He also observed, though, that there were changes going on as different groups of people with different ideas of how the environment was to be used, they too were changing the environment. And so here's Old Enterprise, which ends up being pretty well destroyed. Some of the sections are still there. But also, here's one, and I don't know which one of the mounds this is. But if we take a look at Asa Randall's work, he's a PhD, recent PhD out of the University of Florida, that studied these mounds. you can see that each one of those little black spots that's on that map, around 100 of them, represent shell middens that date to the Mount Taylor period. And this is roughly 7 to 3,000 years ago. The neat thing to think about is these people had not invented pottery yet. These were pre-ceramic individuals that were living here. Pottery, it would be another 2,000 years before pottery would be invented someplace along the southeastern coast, maybe near Jacksonville or one of those places. Then Jeffries Wymans, 93 years later, he ends up making the same trek down Lake Monroe and to the Outland Midden, which dates to 5,600 years BP. And you can see that little pink spot that is there. That is where, that would be the location of the Lake Monroe Outlet Midden. And we're going to talk about that because it's an example of what Bartram saw, but also what Bartram did not see. With time comes travel, and Indiana Jones reminds us all that it's not the years, it's the miles. So here we are. When this roadway, I-4, was expanded, federal mitigation kicked in, and you can see here's the highway in the middle of that, but those contours that you see are the living areas of the Lake Monroe people. So the excavations took place in 2000. We have been remiss in our duties publishing this. These have not been published. So you folks are getting the first handle on it. This would be a cross-section of where the excavation takes and shaves down through, removes the material, exposing the various layers of material. And as what you're seeing here is that light brown stuff are apple snail and banded mystery snail, and then the darker stuff that's more difficult to see is Elliptiobucklei. That's one of the pearly mussels, and so those of you that have spent time exploring the St. Johns River, these animals are going to be very common to you. You're going to recognize those. So we're going to use zooarchaeology to deconstruct Lake Monroe Outland Midden fauna. This is what Bartram didn't see. He didn't have the opportunity, because it's not for another 100+ years did anyone start thinking about zooarchaeology. So first of all, it was screened by the archaeologist. Those students that I showed you, we 1 banana push, 2 banana pull, that they did the sorting. And then it was prepared for curation in the collections at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and it was quantified. So I want to give you just a summary of what we find out. Now, many of you might think, well, deer, raccoon, possum, animals like that. This is a summary where I've not listed the 44 species that were identified in the faunal assemblage. Out of this, we were able to calculate that there was 5,934 individual animals that were represented here, and so this took almost a year to identify. This frequency distribution shows that only 5 species really accounted for anything in the environment. And these were the apple snail, the viviparous, which is a banded mystery snail, and then, of course, Elliptiobucklei, the pearly mussel. So this was the base plate. And then for the fishes that were there, lake chubsucker, catfish, the sunfishes like Bartram had drawn, and garfish were among those animals that were most utilized. There's very few of terrestrial species that occur in here. The small sizes of these animals, because we went and we measured each one of the vertebrae of the fishes. Yes, we do that.
You were very, very bad. That was the joke.
Yeah, you're right. We think that one of the key elements of gathering these animals was with the use of fine mesh nets, and many of these are less than 1/4 of an inch in mesh, if you will. So little bitty fish like that. So Lake Monroe, Outlet Midden, conclusions. The faunal assemblage documents a rich and stable fishery that was primarily associated with riverine and lacustrine ecosystems. The assemblages contain core species that quickly recover when over-harvested. Now I'd like to turn here to the art and the technology that Bartram didn't see. And so these stone pieces, flint or chalcedony that you see, if you'll notice, all of these have a little hook on them or a little pointy end. Well, those are burins, and in the modern toolkit, if you were going to scribe metal or plastic or some material, you would use a burin, and many times you would chuck these up in a lathe. And this was one of the tools that they had. Now this is the distal end, very end of the foot bone on a deer. And if you'll notice on the other end, that whole chunk of bone has been ringed and then snapped. So they were going after these long shafts of bone. And what did they turn them into? Bone pins. And so these are some of the bone pins that came from the Lake Monroe Outlet Midden. Now here's a really neat thing. I want to call your attention to this one all the way up on the left that has the 4 little balls on it and then a broken end. If you'll notice, there's a dark stuff that is kind of in between. That's the resin that after 5,600 years still survived when we started looking at this. So something had been attached to this. Then we have a number of these that some of you might refer to these as bone beads, but some of them are really large and they could have been used as tools. For instance, putting cordage through it and pulling it to lock it in place. So nets and bags and that sort of thing are the things that we don't see, and also the things that Bartram didn't see. This is a deer tine, so on the very pointy end of a deer's rack. But if you'll notice here in this end, that's been drilled out, and so that's a socketed point that they're using to either hook to a handle or maybe a spear point. These we see actually worldwide, and some of them are actually have a line hooked to them. So when you hit an animal with it, it breaks away from the spear, and then you have the cordage when this thing is embedded in the flesh. Now, one of the interesting things, what are we, about 50 miles from the coast? Is that right? Okay. So we have a really nice representation of marine resources that were in this assemblage as well. And you see we have gray shark that's been drilled. I don't know the sharks that are down here that have been notched, but then on the left is tiger shark, and it's difficult to see, but tiger shark teeth by and large are serrated. The one next to it is not serrated, and we believe that this is from use. And if you were to handle this, you would come up to the very edge on the left and the right. That's where the binding would have covered the tooth. Those are not worn away. So we're seeing use wear on this. And so how did they use that? And you can see here with this chunk of bone, this bone cylinder, you can actually see the serrations that have taken place as somebody 5,600 years ago took and fashioned this into some sort of tool. As I noted, this is pre-ceramic times, so how they were cooking this stuff and that sort of thing is a difficult question to address. However, this is an animal called Busicon contrarium or sinistrum. It's a left-handed whelk, and they've taken and they've broken out the columella, cleaned it out, and you can see on the left they've burned the bottom out of this, so they were using that shell to cook with. But then you go over to this section and you can see that dark haze that's in there. That's the residue that was left after 5,600 years of deposition. So this is a really neat site with all sorts of evidence. A shell spatula, I have no idea what this was used for. Isn't that neat? And then this is another kind of cool thing as well. The oyster that you see on the right has a purposeful drilled out hole in it. Those others, those cockles and a thing called Glycymeris, I've got arrows pointing to the little holes in the umbo of that shell. Those were done by a predatory snail that had actually drilled that out. So these shells were actually collected over on the coast or traded, there may have been an active trading, and brought to the site. Those are not food. They're using that for something else, adornos, what have you. Let me go right here, and then I'll show you the beads. Okay, these were all over the site. You couldn't sling a cat without hitting one of these. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But these little perforators that you see here, the very ends of those fit quite nicely in those little holes. So these were the drills that they were using to make those beads. Columella bead drilled out. And then to extend the reach of these people toward the west, this the flint that you see here is actually out of the Ocala limestone formation. It's not local. And I'll also call your attention, if you will notice, this stuff is either waxy looking, that white stuff. The red is kind of waxy looking and red color. And then all the way to the left, fossil coral. All of these have been heat treated to improve their flakeability, if you will, their workability. And so here's more evidence of the work that they were doing. If you'll notice this one, third one from the left, how anyone would be able, in our time, to be able to flake stone like this and be able to put something together that looks like that. That's just marvelous work. And then, you've probably heard Florida doesn't have any rocks. Well, that's not altogether true. But this is a non-native stone, and we don't know where this came from or what its provenance. But it's a bone bead, and you can actually look down the hole here where over a 3-inch piece of stone, this has been drilled out through the other end. So I come to the end of this, and this is a drawing or a photograph that was put together by the Nature Conservancy. And so I'm going to ask the question, what did Bartram see as he made his transit through the St. Johns River? He saw a landscape that was irreparably changed for 5,000 years before he arrived in the St. Johns Valley. Shell middens, by their very nature, represent anthropogenic change. Anthropogenesis means change, alteration done at the hand of humans. He did not witness a pristine environment when he came here. It had all been changed 5,000 years before. So when we think of Native Americans as not having an impact on the environment, then we have to rethink that and do a little more study. The formation of shell middens changed the ecological systems. Heavy exploitation of aquatic resources had their own environmental consequences. He also saw environmental changes taking place at the hands of the Spanish and the British as they tamed the wilderness. Anthropogenic change is not the result of the level of cultural complexity, but it's the way that we humans actually do business. And then finally, what did Bartram not see? He did not witness a people that were intimately and elegantly adapted to the aquatic environment. If you imagine making your living at your own wits and doing the adaptation that was necessary to feed yourself and your family, he did not have an opportunity to witness the technical and artistic skill that existed during the pre-ceramic archaic period. And so I end it here, and I have time for questions? Sam? Yeah, okay. I'm going to take 5 minutes of questions if you care to.
2 questions, if I may. Where was the Shiloh Cemetery that you mentioned? I'm sorry.
Do you know the place called Rosewood?
Yes.
It's near Rosewood.
Okay.
And I'm going to tell you, it is one of the places, I'm not easily influenced by much of anything. But when I walked into that cemetery 15 years ago, and I visited it ever since, now and again, I was taken by the fact that I knew who those people were when I walked away from it. These were people that were maritime people that had some sort of distant relationship with Native Americans that lived there before them. It is a remarkable place. And the other thing that's remarkable about it is you can see these families where 6-month-old child dies of yellow fever in the 1890s, the next child up, and then the mother. And I know, because I fish there also, I know the families that are related to those people. Now, those of you that don't know about Rosewood, it was one of the last massacres that we had of Native Americans in 1923. And there was a guy there by the name of Frank Wright. And when it was exposed what had happened in the 1990s, one of Frank Wright's relatives went out and with a big chunk of concrete that he had poured, and with press-on letters wrote, "Frank Wright, Hero Father." This was a guy that was a merchant, and he didn't like what was going on, and he hid a lot of the African Americans that were being chased out and killed there during the uprising. And he was truly a hero. And so the other thing that you get from Shiloh is you get a sense of ancestor worship and reverence that was there. Other questions? So, by the way, I'm taken by that place. It's wonderful. And I will tell you after this exactly where it is. All right. Who else?
I did have a second question.
Yes.
You mentioned something about Jacksonville being associated with where ceramics were.
I was using that as one possible example. Someplace along the Georgia Bight goes from roughly Cape Fear, North Carolina, all the way to Canaveral, and it's the largest embayment that we have, and it's known for its extreme tides. someplace along there, probably in central Georgia, maybe down to Jacksonville. For several reasons we're saying that. Ceramics, fiber-tempered ceramics were invented. So that's like the Apple computer being invented right there. So think about what it means to go out and to be able to cook something in a pot instead of whatever else was going on here. Yeah, right. Other questions? Listen, yes?
The nets, you said they were using quarter-inch mesh. What were they made from?
Yeah, we've had some experimental botanists working with that, and it looks like one of the best possibilities is a processed material from palm, so that brown webby stuff. And in fact, the guy that was doing the work, he was actually able to make the cordage and then turn out the nets. We do have some later on, more toward the present, ceramics that has net and press ceramics on it. But because we know what the size of the fish are, we know that roughly what the size would have to be to do that. Other questions? Yes. Oh my God! It's one of the hot topics in archaeology. I can't believe it. You know, it's everything from ritual behavior to just a regular old village where you're throwing stuff out the back door. But the interesting thing is the central area that you saw in that drawing is totally devoid of anything. It's been swept clean. So something's going on there, and we're not sure what the reason is. Films at 9 o'clock. Anyone else? Yes.
How about the Windover Pond?
Windover Pond, 8,000 years. Yep. Yeah.
I read a book on that, and it said that they found genetic material in those burial sites.
Brain material.
Yeah, genetic material, and they said they were Caucasians and not Native American, like what we call Indian.
Yeah, well, we've had these things, various groups that have moved across. There's also a little dog that has been implicated as having where they've done the DNA work on them, has an affinity with Korea. So go figure, you know.
They also found fabrics there.
They had fabrics, and it was as fine as T-shirt. Yeah.
The great exhibit in the is it Brevard County?
The Brevard County Museum,
Yeah.
Their Natural History Museum.
Yeah.
The book is great.
I think that's Glenn.
Windover Pond.
Yeah, that's Glenn Doran, I think, that did that. And Glenn Doran is one of the great teachers that's out there. So your money that went to cover his salary is money well spent. Just a lot of his students have just turned out to be, pretty important people. Yeah.
Thank you.
Dick, thank you.
What I'd like to do now is introduce Mr. T.R. Henderson, the president of the National Bartram Conference. And he's made the journey several years now here to Palatka from Alabama with his daughter Cosette, who also accompanied him the last couple trips. And she's just a pleasure to be around. And she's really fun to talk to, and she really absorbs and understands and tries to learn more about what I'm talking about when I do my children's interpretations here. Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, William Bartram. Okay, yes, I'm an officer with Bartram Trail Conference, as is Brad Sanders, our next speaker, and Sam Carr also. A lot of work going on there, and I appreciate the invitation to be a part of this. And I just wanted to throw out that I've been in love with this part of the country, or in one way or the other, since I read The Yearling back a long time ago, and then got into travels, and it's fallen in love again with that. This is a very unique place, and I appreciate the work that's going on in your recognition of from the National Park Service for your National Recreational Trail. I know how much work is involved in that, and it just feeds into our ambition for the Bartram Trail Conference for a southeastern regional trail. And that's one thing Sam and Brad are working on big time, and it's going to take a little while to accomplish that, but this is the first step that y'all have done here, and you've given us some how-tos on the whole thing. So I want to hear from Brad right here, myself, and I'm sure y'all do too. Brad Sanders is an officer and a board member of the Bartram Trail Conference and a retired school teacher. He's into art, photography, and writing, and been working on this trail across the southeast for a number of years, and he probably knows as much about it as anybody. So, Brad, what have you got to tell us about that?
Okay, Sam just mentioned my book. And I usually don't anymore because it's out of print. But you can find used copies of it, and some places have new copies on sale. If you go to Amazon or ABE Books or A-Libris, it's Guide to William Bartram's Travels. And what it's all about is a non-academic book for people who are interested in William Bartram who want to go where William Bartram was and travel where William Bartram traveled.
It's a great book.
I figured since I was doing all this work, following around where he went and trying to figure out what he saw, I could write it up for other people to follow in my footsteps, and I followed in William Bartram's footsteps. But to start with here, I'm going to be talking about the William Bartram Heritage Corridor. How many of you are aware that the Bartram Trail extends beyond Florida? Okay, so you're not just Florida-centric, right? There you go. Yeah. Of course, people in North Carolina think that the Bartram Trail is in western North Carolina. This sign right here is at the corner of Spring Hill Road and the Okefenokee Parkway in the central part of Camden County, Georgia. And it's one of the few remaining artifacts from an effort back in the 1980s to mark the Bartram Trail everywhere. And when I first started doing this research back in the middle 1990s, there were actually 2 of these signs in Camden County. At one time, there were 4 signs all the way from the Altamaha River to the St. Mary's River. Now there's only 1 left. People have forgotten about them. They got stuck there about 1982, and it either stayed there or the bulldozer ran over it or the hunters shot it up. There is another sign at Fort Hull in Alabama on the old Federal Road. The Federal Road was marked somewhat, but in order to lay the groundwork for what we're doing now, this project has been ongoing for over 40 years, trying to establish a national Bartram Trail. When the National Trails Act was made into law in 1973, I believe it is, there were a number of projects put forward to be researched as to whether they could be a national recreation trail. And I believe the first one, the most important that got the attention of more people, was the Lewis and Clark Trail. The government pushed that forward. The Bartram Trail was in that list of trails to research and to look into. And crazily enough, George Wallace of Alabama was one of the people who helped create the Bartram Trail Conference, because in order to get a national trail, you have to have a nonprofit organization of citizens who have input in making decisions and gathering information and having meetings. And that's an important component of it. So the Bartram Trail Conference got started about 1976 or 77 It worked for 2 years. They published Bartram Heritage in 1979 and concluded that a national Bartram recreational trail was not feasible under the descriptions of what a recreation trail is supposed to be. A few years later, about 3 years later, another report came out through the National Park Service, and it was, I think, called the Bartram Project or something like that. And they concluded that neither could it be a national scenic trail or a national historic trail for various reasons that we can't get into right here, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that William Bartram was a rambling man. He did not start at point A and go to point B like a military road is, or an immigrant road. The Oregon Trail goes from around St. Louis to Oregon. You know, it's linear. And William Bartram wandered, although, like Lewis and Clark, who were on the Missouri River, William Bartram in Florida was on the St. Johns River, so that's easy to figure out. But a lot of other places it wasn't. A lot of the areas are now towns, cities, privately owned. And the second report from the National Park Service was 1982. And even though it concluded that a national trail was not feasible, they made suggestions about commemorating William Bartram because he's an important figure. And their suggestions essentially became what is known as a heritage corridor. But still, there's not a William Bartram heritage corridor, although there are 40 others that have been put in place since 1982, not one for William Bartram. So what we're trying to do is take those two reports, generate new interest, and get a national a William Bartram heritage corridor established. So, what is, wait a minute, but I need these to see page up and page down. There we go. A heritage corridor is not an easy concept. It's not as easy to understand as the North Carolina Bartram Trail, which is a hiking trail, or the Bartram canoe trails on the St. Johns River and on the Tensas River, or the Oregon Trail, which you can still follow parts of it. It's more of a defined area that includes different sites in different areas. The closest thing that we have that can help us understand this is the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor, which goes from north of Wilmington, North Carolina, all the way down to Palm Alley, south of Jacksonville, even farther down to the Palm Coast, and down to across the river from Palatka. Palatka is not included in it, but everything on the other side of the river is. And what it does is to collect under one umbrella and to promote research and appreciation of history and sites related to the Gullah Geechee culture of the coastal southeastern United States. Okay. In the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor, you have specific sites. For example, the first African Baptist church on Cumberland Island. Hog Hammock, the community, which is a still vibrant community on Sapelo Island. All of Sapelo Island is part of the Heritage Corridor. All of Cumberland Island is part of the Heritage Corridor. Even Fernandina is part of the Heritage Corridor because Amelia Island is important in the history of the blacks along the coast of Georgia since the 1700s. And on Amelia Island, it could also be part of the Bartram Heritage Corridor. This is the Bartram marker that's at the marina in downtown Fernandina. At the Bartram Trail Conference back in March in Baton Rouge, we decided that we were going to pursue this again, the concept of memorializing William Bartram in a national way as a heritage corridor, because we think that now it might work, or it will work. We're confident it will work. So we're putting together some information, and we're making contacts. We're rewriting the original Bartram Heritage Report that the Bartram Trail Conference put together. And the most important thing is we're going to reach out to everybody along the way. And to get started, I made some maps. And of course, the first map is the entire southeastern United States, 7 states, and I included Tennessee, but William Bartram didn't go to Tennessee. But it just makes a nice shape, so I had to put that in. But it goes all along the coast of North Carolina, South Carolina, the Savannah River, the coast of Georgia, the St. Johns River, through Gainesville to the Suwannee River, across Alabama, down to Mobile, Pensacola, and by water all the way to Baton Rouge and Point Coupee. And in all, if you wanted to get in your car and retrace all that, it'd be about 2,500 miles. In Mississippi, he didn't touch land, but Mississippi is included because he saw Mississippi. And there's a line in Mississippi that represents what William Bartram would have seen. Of course, the DeSoto National Forest, the Mississippi Sandhill Crane National Wildlife Refuge. So when we talk to people, and I think Sam asked me to do this because my wife Diane and I have made the first contact with a legislator, as Jim Hightower calls him, a Congress critter. And we found out that our representative, Jody Heiss, is on the House Committee of Natural Resources and Public Land. And those are the people who are going to make the decision, who we need to go through first. So it was fortunate for us that our representative was on that committee. Diane made contact with him at a meeting back in May or April, I think it was. And not with him, I'm sorry, his district manager. And we found out, do not try to contact your legislator, your representative. Contact the person that runs the show, that works for them. They've got the time, but they have the ear of the legislator. So we met Josh Finley, and Diane told him what we were doing about William Bartram, and his ears perked up because he knew who William Bartram was. And she said, we're trying to get this thing going with a National Heritage Corridor, and it's going to take an act of Congress. And he said, I want to hear about this. And we set up a meeting, and we got a presentation together, starting with the map, to show him what it was, because he's like a lot of people. He knows a little bit about William Bartram, but he doesn't know the whole picture. And so we got his interest. And because I am in Georgia, and Diane and I are doing the Georgia part of this, I made a map of Georgia showing where William Bartram went, the blue dotted line, and it's kind of hard to see with the colors here, but the beige area is a corridor that's about 25 miles wide. Originally, the Bartram Trail Conference had a 50-mile corridor, 25 miles on each side of where they think William Bartram went. But I kind of wanted to focus in more specifically on really where we know William Bartram was. And in the map, I've included places like wildlife management areas that are near where he traveled, the towns that he visited, the towns that are there now that weren't there when he came through, like Macon and Columbus, historic sites, national parks, state parks, county parks, because sometimes county parks are really important. So when we put together a packet, we had a PR release saying what we were going to be doing. And we had the southeastern map, showed that to him. Then we showed them the map of Georgia. But because our representative is not only concerned, but mainly concerned with his constituents in the 10th District of Georgia, which is where we live, I did a map of the 10th District of Georgia so that they could see who in their district is intimately, not intimately involved, but closely related to the Bartram Trail that we have in mind. And Augusta is not in our district. It's a separate district, but of course William Bartram spent quite a bit of time in Augusta. In the blue line, he traveled through Wrightsboro, the Quaker village, to the Great Buffalo Lick, which nobody knew where it was, but we kind of now have a good idea through some work in the archives in Atlanta. Then through the town where I grew up, Stevens, Georgia. I grew up in the suburbs of Stevens, which is just one farm that was north of town. It was us. And through Crawford, up through Winterville, Georgia, and then it leaves the 10th District. But when William Bartram went to the Mississippi River and went to the Creek Nation, he went through the southern part of the 10th District, through Glasscock and Warren County, and through Milledgeville, and crossed the Oconee River at Milledgeville. And what's really significant is that was the Lower Creek trading path, which became the boundary between Hancock County and Washington County, Warren County and Glasscock County. So it's easy to follow, but there's not always a road there. But people get excited about that, especially a county like Glasscock County, which I think has maybe 20,000 people living in it. If they knew that somebody famous came through their county, they'll get excited. And which leads into one of the most important things that we learned about our work with Josh Finley. From the first meeting we had with Josh Finley, I think at this time he hadn't mentioned anything to Representative Heiss. He waited until he got some more information. But he said, to emphasize the economic value to local communities, especially in rural areas, and that's fairly easy because a lot of the areas that William Bartram traveled through were still rural areas. And we explained to him, and he did a lot of research, and he found out that a heritage corridor doesn't protect land that's not already protected. It doesn't purchase any new land. It would include within it land that states, counties, cities, and the federal government might own. It doesn't need a lot of money because you're not buying land. You've got minimal staff. A lot of what happens is coordinating the efforts that are already being done by many different agencies and many different people. County commissioners, Parks and Recreation Services, National Forests. Those people have their budgets and they're doing what they're going to be doing. That doesn't come into the Heritage Corridor's purview. The Heritage Corridor is there to coordinate efforts to commemorate William Bartram in those areas and to have a minimal staff, to create a website, and to do promotion. It's kind of like a clearinghouse. So, to emphasize the economic value to these people, like when I'm going to be sending information to chambers of commerce and local historical societies in Georgia, and emphasizing that this can bring tourism in. Josh said, don't talk about land protection, especially not now. And we don't have to because the Heritage Corridor does not protect land, and it doesn't purchase land. Emphasize the fact that a heritage corridor can be created with no land acquisition and with minimal expense. Make this a multi-state project and get a congressional representative from each state on board. And we already knew that it was going to be a multi-state project, but we need to have people involved in each state, and we need to have a legislator from each state who, when the time comes, will put their name on the bill that will make this happen. Make connections with local organizations such as historical societies, boards of commissioners, and economic development offices along the Bartram Trail. And the most important thing is if there's no local interest or push or request or demand, it won't happen. It's the local groundswell that will cause it to happen. Legislation will require a senior member of Congress to co-sponsor legislation, and he said, for example, Johnny Isaacson or Marco Rubio, people who everybody knows, who've been there long enough, their name is the main name on the legislation, even though we might have a dozen other people. And Jody Heiss is in his second term, and he's considered a junior representative. He doesn't have the power yet to introduce that kind of legislation. And he said, of course, be patient. This may take a while, and we already knew that. It's been about 45 years, but we're tired of waiting. And the second meeting we had, that Josh Findlay himself requested this meeting. He wanted us to have a teleconference with some people in Washington, D.C., and they were two D.C. staff members. Nick Brown is a legislative aide for Jody Heiss, and Terry Camp, and he's the staff member of the House Committee on Natural Resources, and he works for the chair of that committee, Rob Bishop of Utah. And we didn't talk to Rob Bishop, but Terry Camp told us, he kept saying, well, my boss thinks, and my boss believes. He was telling us what his boss thinks about all this, not what he thought about it. And he said that Rob Bishop is cautious of creating any new funding because it doesn't sunset. And he said once the Heritage Corridor is supposed to get an influx of money, like $300,000. And to me that sounds like a lot of money. But considering that, Tom Price, is that his name? Well, anyway, the guy who just resigned, who is from Georgia, was spending that much money every day on travel. It's not much money, and it's supposed to drop down after 3 or 4 years and then be a minimal amount to just maintain websites and a basic staff. And he believes that once people get money, they don't want to let go of it. Well, he's right, and it's not, you can say it's a liberal or conservative thing, but this is not much money we're talking about. And of course, we think that this is important. And Rob Bishop is concerned about property rights. And they gave us an example, the case of Dominion Power wanted to put some high-tension power lines, transmission lines, across a river, and I can't remember which one it was, if it was the Rappahannock or something in Virginia. And the area where they wanted to put it through was made a national scenic river, and the organization that looks over that didn't want them to put the power line through there, put it somewhere else, move it north, move it south, or something like that. So he saw that as an infringement of property rights. The power company can't put the power line where they want to because these people want to keep the river looking the way it is. And that was his example. He believes heritage corridors would be better served if transferred from the National Park Service to the Department of Commerce. And there may be a valid point there, but and I thought about that at first. I thought, well, that kind of does make sense. But then I thought, except for the fact that the mindset of the National Park Service and the Department of Commerce are completely different, how is that going to serve us? But Terry Camp said, there may be no need for a new study. Congress and the National Park Service can just review the original study from 1982. Every heritage corridor, recreational trail, scenic trail that gets officially recognized has to have a study. And Congress says, National Park Service, do us a study. They do the study. It goes to Congress, and somebody writes a bill, and it happens. But with a few tweaks and some new information added, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can already use what we have. And that's what we're working on, is updating everything. At some point in here, I think that I almost was going to debate one of the things that Terry Camp was saying about property rights. And Josh he said, we'll talk about that afterwards. So I pretty much just stopped and listened for the rest of the teleconference. And Josh, in kind words, said to not be discouraged. This committee is dominated by people from the West. And people who live in Utah and are politicians have a completely different view of public land from somebody in Florida who's a politician. And they have a lot of public land, and we don't have as much public land. And some of them don't want as much public land, and some of us want more public land. But a heritage corridor is not going to create new public land. It's just going to use what's there. And I think what I was trying to do was kind of make that point. And I think what Josh was saying was, it's falling on deaf ears. They're not going to listen to it. They've already said what they're going to say, and this is what they believe, and no things that you can say to them will change that. But Josh said, these people who are on the committee, who run it, are from big Western states. He said, but that's not going to keep it from happening. What you have to have is Southern legislators. He said, if you have 7, 8, 10, or 12 legislators from the South who put their name on a bill for the Bartram Heritage Corridor, it will happen, despite what anybody else says or thinks. So I'm trying not to be too political about this, but, living in Georgia, I was just kind of taken aback by these, I thought they would say, William Bartram, yeah, I know who he is. Well, he probably doesn't, because he lives in Utah. Okay, the third time we met with Josh, we were with our representative, and Jody Heiss was in Oglethorpe County, and July the 21st, and it was an economic development tour. They took him around and showed him some of the industry and the farms in Oglethorpe County, and Josh wanted us to meet up with him at the end for a very quick 1-hour little tour of Oglethorpe County where William Bartram traveled. And, as you know, a lot of the Bartram Trail, you can't take somebody there and show them, and it looks like the Bartram Trail. It's just a dirt road and it's woods, or it's a river full of water with beautiful fish and flowers and stuff like that. But I hit upon the idea that the trail that William Bartram was following with what's called the Survey Party, when that part of Georgia was purchased by Georgia, later became part of a railroad bed. The Georgia Railroad, which was established in 1832, on high ground. The trail was following high ground. The railroad, for obvious reasons, was following high ground, the same trail. And the railroad was originally pulled by horse. The cars were pulled by horses from Union Point to Athens, Georgia. And in 1840, they got a locomotive. And this was the third railroad in the nation. Well, there's an effort now to create a bike trail on the old railroad bed called the Firefly Trail. So the Firefly Trail and the Bartram Trail exactly coincides in that part of Oglethorpe County. So I had something to tell him that was historical about William Bartram, about the industry, the old railroad and how important it was to that part of Georgia, and the effort to try to turn it into a recreation trail. And people would be riding their bicycles from down to Crawford and Stevens. They're going to be stopping and buying water and Cokes and honey buns. And so this is Josh Finley, our angel on the left. And unfortunately, he's not with Jody Heiss's office anymore. He was stolen away by the Republican Party of Georgia. He's now the state director. And there's no new person to take his place yet. And then to the right of him is Amy Stone, the economic development office person in Oglethorpe County. So she was a good person to be on the trip. And then in the middle is Linda Hamley, and she's president of Historic Oglethorpe, and then Jody Heiss, and then myself. And Jody Heiss had a lot of questions, and he found it really fascinating. And he said, keep building up more interest. and get more people involved in other states. And this is to show you what we did on that day. You can see from Stevens to where Arnoldville is. At Stevens is where the trail that William Bartram followed came into what became later the Georgia Railroad. And we drove up through Crawford, and at Arnoldville we stopped at a place called Cherokee Corner. And it's very famous in our part of Georgia. Other people might not have heard of it, but it's the place where when William Bartram and the surveyors were surveying the new purchase, they stopped at the Cherokee Corner, and one survey party went north and one went south to survey the boundary. The Cherokee Corner was an international boundary. It was the boundary between Georgia, the Creek Nation, and the Cherokee Nation. And they all came together at that one point. So when we got out, we had the photo op, and we had something to talk about. So once Josh left Jody Heiss's office, I decided it's time to get involved with meeting some other people in the state. So I made a list of the representatives in the state who are on who include the Bartram Trail. And what I will be doing is give them the Bartram Trail Conference PR release, a map of the Heritage Corridor in the southeast Georgia, and I will make a map of their district. And I will include a little section, a description of Bartram's travels in their district with some excerpts of what William Bartram said, because that always catches people's attention. And in with the PR release, I'll have a synopsis of the past studies and legislation, just real brief description with links to the original documents. And this is the list that I have started of each county that the Bartram Trail goes through, the Board of Commissioners, economic development people, historical societies, people like that. And I'm starting with Camden County, since Diane and I live part-time in St. Mary's, making contact with people there. And we're dividing this up. Sam and I hope Ken and Dean and Janice and other people and Dick, you've got a lot more enthusiasm here than we have in any one place in Georgia. We've got people all over the state who are interested in Bartram, but it doesn't happen in one place quite. There's not a critical mass like we have here. So I figured the next step is to make some maps for Florida, so Sam and everybody can get on the way. The next is going to be Alabama. So I made this map for Sam in his career, but because Florida is a big state, I decided it needed a second map to focus in on North Florida, because Pensacola is part of it, but it's way over there in Alabama. And the whole southern part of Florida would be involved in this. So, down to New Smyrna Beach. If you know much about William Bartram, you know that he spent time in New Smyrna Beach when DeBron was surveying the lots for the town of New Smyrna. William Bartram was in the survey party. So this is Florida, and I tried to include as much important information about sites related to Bartram that wouldn't get it too cluttered. I could put a lot of stuff in there, but it would get way too cluttered. And this is part of the presentation I did at the Bartram Trail Conference in March. There are trails that are already named for William Bartram, and it stems from the work from back in the 1980s. One of them, which was originally the Bartram Trail in Mississippi and the Soto National Forest, got renamed, and it looked like that was what was going to be happening. People were going to start forgetting about William Bartram. But lo and behold, there's a new resurgence of interest in William Bartram. So these are all national recreation trails. And then there are other trails that are in national forests, national parks. local rails to trails, local hiking trails, biking trails, and these are all over the southeast. So this has to do with recreation. And this is not even talking about historical sites. Driving routes that people can get on and drive from one place to another. In Florida, the most significant one is from Switzerland to down past the Shands Bridge, the Florida 13, is the William Bartram Memorial Highway. And I made a list like this for each state. In Georgia, we have Okmulgee Mounds National Monument. The town of Midway, the town of Darien, the whole entire town of Darien, because he lived there for the better part of a year. And then, of course, some selected sites in Florida. And these are the ones that I just consider the most important. This is not the exhaustive list, because you could probably have that many just in Putnam County. Now you all know about the Bartram Trail Conference. We have a website, bartramtrail.org. It's really easy. If you type in Bartram Trail, the first thing that comes up is the Bartram Trail Conference. We have a section on the Bartram Trail in the 7 different states. And when you go to the main page, there's a map. Any page for any of the states like Florida, Georgia, Alabama, there's a link to the map. And the map is a Google map that's got Bartram's route on it. And I have been slowly, over the past 2 years, putting in markers for sites that are important, like where William Bartram wrote about something at the place where we know he wrote it. Or I have a map of one of the Bartram historical markers, or a map of that place, like the shrimp boats in Darien. And since it's a Google map, you can zoom in and you can carry it on your iPhone or your Samsung phone with you everywhere you go, and you can get down really close and follow the Bartram Trail as you're traveling around. So you can make it generic, or you can get really close to that. So, okay, now do you know?
I was asked the other day, so we really wanted to take a trip doing this, but we don't have a map. Yeah, you do.
Yes, you do. Well, somebody asked me about this map, and when I put it together, I sent a link to all the board members of the Bartram Trail Conference and asked them, and said, you have permission to add things to this now. Please do. And then at the next conference, I was talking about the map, and somebody said, oh, we've got a map? Send me a link to that. I said, well, I already did, but I will do it again for you to ignore. How do you zoom in on this?
I have no idea.
Oh. Would it be a plus, plus, plus?
I think so, yeah. I think it's
No.
Control plus.
Okay. Of course, this is difficult without a mouse.
It is difficult.
But you can see that we've got the route, and we've got all those little red dots and blue dots that mean something. I can't remember which is which, but some of them are Bartram sites, and some of them are just things that would interpret William Bartram. And a lot of what we do is we want to find things that interpret William Bartram, where you can see what he saw, a plant that he saw, an animal that he saw. So that's all I have to say, but the point is we need everybody's help to make this happen. To beat the bushes. If you know people who are influential, mention it to them. I am going to, when I get home, make on the bartramtrail.org website, a section just devoted to the Heritage Corridor so that people can go and download the PR release, they can download the maps, and you can go to your legislator. Does anybody know a representative personally?
Johnny Ixea.
You know who Johnny Ixea is in?
My sister-in-law worked for him.
And that's in Georgia. Well, there you go. And he's a good man. I think he'll find what we want to do interesting. And, one thing I forgot. In Louisiana, Tom Akelin, who lives in Lacombe, has established the Tammany Trace bike trail And I think he's gotten it recognized as a national recreation trail. He's working on a lakes to bayous or rivers to lakes heritage corridor. And he's taken on the William Bartram Heritage Corridor also as part of his work. And he just turned 80 years old, but he's not slowing down. He's got 3 projects going on, and one of them is ours. So we have him in Louisiana, and he's been trying to make contact with his legislators. And he's got an advantage in that his cousin is the Secretary of State for Louisiana. You're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Really, thank you. It's been a long time since I've been able to give a talk, so I might stutter a wee bit, and I might do a lot of uhs, but work with me. And once I get this flow going, I move pretty fast and keep the images going, so you have a lot of visual intake. And I'm going to throw some humor in here, so I like to start off with a little humor. Anybody know what this bird is? Kiwi, kind of funny. This might show my age, but what it actually is, I've given it a new name. It's not quite scientific. It's called the Philostylurus maximus. I mean, look at that. And look at that bird. That's Philostylur. So we know where she got it from. So that's a lot of fun. I throw a little humor in, but fun. But I found that picture on the internet looking for a specific bird, and that came up. And wow, Bartram would have loved that. I don't know. It's a Philostylur. It's a Philostylur. Come on. They made it up. God has a sense of humor, and I love it. This ain't going to work. I had some music to go along with this, but now as an artist, I've been painting since I was 9 years old, and when I was 10, I read my first novel, and I was drawing. I was very sick. I had asthma a lot, kind of a bad, disruptive family home, so I would escape into drawing as a 4th grader, and that allowed me to escape into things, and I would create scenes. And I was drawing Indians. I loved Indians. When I was 9 years old, I found an arrowhead in the creek behind my home in St. Petersburg, where I grew up. And at that time, we were playing pirates, so we used to live on the bay there and play on the Bounty. And they had these mannequin figures with wigs on of pirates and whatnot. And me and my brother used to ride our bikes downtown, and we'd climb on board. And my brother one time put lipstick on one of the mannequins. But we were into pirates, and then we're playing at the creek, playing our mom's costume jewelry they gave to us, and Bounty treasure chest made of cedar. And we're digging a hole, and we found an arrowhead, and then we found a couple of them. And instantly, me and my friends, we were into Indians. And we didn't play Indians, we were Indians. And you got to talk to a bunch of Florida boys, blonde hair, white kid, blue eyes, and putting all the Indian stuff. And I loved Indians. And at that time, my mom had divorced for the 4th time, and she met a gentleman, and he was of Creek native descent. And by the time I was 12, we moved to Oklahoma. And I wasn't ready for it, so I still kind of hibernated into my world of drawing. But what got me into drawing and doing my artwork was when I read the book Jaws, and then I saw that movie. That movie changed my life. I tell you, watching that shark, and then as I read about the story of the making of the movie, the artists that were behind it, drawing it, Joe Alves, the art director, I wanted to do that. I wanted to make Jaws movies all my life. I was convinced. But I started drawing scenes, and I was still in the Indian things, but the scenes I was drawing of Indians were remarkable, and I wanted to know about those arrowheads. So I looked up Indians, and all I would find is Indians in teepees and war bonnets, and then when Columbus discovered America, and they had these horrible images of these Indians bowing, or these native people bowing down to these Spaniards in war bonnets, Indians in war bonnets in the Caribbean and Florida and whatnot. And the next thing you know, in the history books, by 4th, 5th grade in Florida at that time, there wasn't much history, but it was good enough. But still, it goes right to Pilgrims, and nothing about Florida, nothing about Paleo-Indians, nothing about early people. It just went right to Pilgrims, and not even about Custer, I had to learn that on my own. So I was fascinated. So I was always into looking for history. So I continued to find a lot of historical material, Indian pottery, Indian arrowheads, in and around where I lived in St. Petersburg. And as a young adult, after college, I had learned much about archaeology. I started being a collector by the time I was like 25, a serious collector. And at first it was innocent, but it started off innocent enough because I knew there was a science behind archaeology, and I wasn't an archaeologist. But when I went off to college, I did take a minor in archaeology at Armstrong State College. I should speak into this better. But one of the first finds that really got me into painting Florida history was this find here in Tampa Bay. It was after the March no-name storm of 1993, which was a really bad storm in Florida. And the water had blown out of the bay, and in this one bay area on Courtney Kimball Causeway, we knew there was a lot of material out there. And at low tide, during the storm, or just before the storm hit, I had found this spear point in the marsh. And it turns out, identified by Albert Goodyear, who's now the director of the Southeastern Institute of Archaeology, that it is a 12,000-year Florida Clovis point. 12,000 years old. That's 6,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt, the high period of the pharaohs. In Florida. Now, these weren't cavemen. These weren't men that were people using this item that were, what did we draw? Oh, Slim Drive. These weren't people that were cavemen, These were people just like you and me that were hunting down these large animals using this particular knife. And, it's the first point that we know of earliest Florida, and the thing is magnificently made. And just like the evolution of technology in any human culture, the first car, the Model T, wasn't a Porsche like we see today with the streamlines. The first car was this crude, horrible, ugly-looking thing. And here we have one of the first weapons patented in the United States, the first known weapon by Native Americans. And this thing is exquisitely made. It's got a distinctive flute up the edge, and the chipping on it, it's almost as thin as a piece of paper, well made. 12,000 years ago. That ain't no caveman. That ain't no bearded Geico caveman, clubbing his woman over the head. These are intelligent people, and I knew there was something more intelligent. In 1992, there began a celebration of the discovery of America by Columbus, and there were all these exhibits being built and displayed to celebrate Columbus's arrival. And the images that I saw of the Native Americans, even in 1992, were appalling. It still showed Indians scantily dressed, as if they were cavemen scratching on the dirt to get a living, that were greeting these Spanish and the ships and all like that. And I was just appalled at that imagery. And one of the first paintings I did after I graduated from college was a painting called The Gator Kill. And it's on the cover of a book by University Press of Florida, Dr. Kevin McCarthy. And I'm looking to see if I have the image of it. And I'm sorry I don't have this in order. I do not have it in order, but it was a scene of two Indians hunting gators along the river. And I dressed them up with tattoos that were reminiscent of that of the French drawings that were done here in North Florida in 1564. I repeated the tattoos that were taken off of images of pottery and bone pins that were found at archaeological sites. Being that I was trained in some degree of archaeology, I was understanding of the previous archaeology that took place in Florida, and a remarkable plethora of artifacts has been uncovered that tells a story just through the artistic expression of the Indians alone, through their pottery, through their crafts, through their jewelry. I started to believe also that the work of flint knappers is not just making a tool, it's also a craft. It's expressing an art, because all you have to do is sharpen a tip to a rock and put it on a stick, and you can stab something. But the Indians of Florida developed a tradition that was so remarkable. And as a response to that Columbus image, I did these paintings that took off. The University of Florida saw them. It started to be used in book covers. Everybody was interested in Native Americans in the 90s. There were powwows everywhere. And I'm a white kid, as white as I get. And I am not Native at all. I'm an Irishman. But I was invited by many Native peoples to come attend their Native American festivals, their powwows and whatnot, especially in Florida in the winter months. And I was recognized all over the place by Native tribes. Today in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, at the Creek Tribal Justice Center, Indians are plagued with a lot of gangster life that is coming into their casino life, because the money's coming in, and with casinos comes trouble. So vote no on any of those amendments in Florida. The Indians are suffering a lot from alcohol addiction, drug addiction, whatnot, as the influx of the crime that comes with that. So there's a lot of trouble on all these reservations with suicide, drug overdose, alcoholism. And so 10 years ago, the Creek Tribal Nation bought 10 images of my paintings in print form to hang in the Tribal Justice Center, because when these kids are going to court in their Tribal Justice Center, this is in Oklahoma, this is in Florida, this is up at Cherokee, North Carolina, my paintings hang there to teach them about their past, so they know that they have a history. They're not, an ethnic culture that we're forgotten, we don't have any hope, and all I have is drugs or alcohol. They're taught through my paintings and the traditional elders a way of life from their past that's remarkable. All the money in the world couldn't buy that kind of acknowledgement, and that help that I can help with others to recognize our history that belongs to you, and it belongs to you, it belongs to all of us as Americans today. And that is what that historical imagery is about that I paint, because I want to tell a story. Just like when Peter Benchley wrote that book, Jaws, he was seeing these images in his head and he wrote them in paper. Steven Spielberg saw those words and put it onto a screen of scenes and images. The paintings that I do, like Steven Spielberg, I want the believers to look at one of my paintings and walk into it. So over the 90s, I was involved very much with painting lots of Native Americans. And this is one of my masterworks I did in 1999 of a flint workshop here in Florida. This is located somewhere near Dade City. And all over Florida, there are lithic scatter sites. Lithic scatter sites are areas where Indians lived and hunted and mined the rock and were chipping it out. This particular site was dug by University of Florida on one side. The medium range date for the longest occupation time was about 4,000, 5,000 BC, 4,500 BC. And it continued on. But the procurement, the projectile points that are found there are magnificently made out of agatized coral. And they're beautiful. They're works of art. And so I wanted to paint a scene of the Indians gathering the stone. It's a ravine. It's a hillside along a lake bed. And on this lake bed, the hills meet down and creeks form at the bottom. The Indians, what they were doing, we found out, where they were going down to the bottom of the hill and digging up these large boulders, chunking them up into smaller football-sized pieces, and they would burn them in fire to bring out the red oxides and make the work more workable. Then they bring basket loads of these large pieces, these preforms. Anybody in a village could chip out a basic triangular shape. But to make these well-made, beautifully made, there was probably, for every village in any area, there was one napper that was incredibly well done. And perhaps in any 50-mile radius, there was one master napper. A napper is a person who works rock, who works flint, works church. So these Indians, what I've shown here is a snapshot daily life in the fall months when the acorns are falling from the trees. That's when the deer fatten up. The Indians leave the coastal habitats and they move inland, and they gather all the materials and they're hunting deer in the fall. That's why hunting's always good in the fall. The deer are fattened up. It's after the rut, and they're making the projectile points. This master here, this might be his son, and his son is standing here watching his father do this work. This is an Indian from another village. His hair is different. He's wearing feathers that are different than theirs. In my painting, it's a scene of the Indian coming in here to do trade with his projectile point. And I have found projectile points like this at that site in the orange groves when they do the irrigation. And I have rubbed my thumb along that blade in remarkable recognition of the workmanship. So in the painting, the Indian is rubbing his thumb along that blade, just as I have done 4,000 years later. And when I found those spear points, I was the first human being to touch that point since it was in that ground 4,000 years ago. Wow! Nothing more remarkable. There's materials all over. They're using deer antler, small spalding rocks that were probably heirlooms passed from one father to another or from one mother to another. Not just men did work on tools. Women did too, but the tradition was often women took care of the household and the immediate area and the fields and the food, and men went hunting and cleared the fields. Even today, amongst the Creek Southeastern Indians, there's some funny things or remarkable things you need to know. When a man marries into the an Indian woman in Creek Seminole Creek, you take the woman's name. You don't take the man's name. And if the man chooses to leave or the woman chooses to leave, the man leaves with nothing. Some things don't change. And there's an old saying that I learned, marriage was grand, divorce is 100 grand. And that's okay. But the Indians did have a lot of wonderful things going on in their life, despite the belief of Europeans that came at the time and saw these people as heathens. They saw them as non-believers, as pagans. That's not the case at all. The more I learned and became indoctrinated into the tribal ways of these Indians, I was convinced that what took place, not always, but what often took place here in America, in North America and South America, was a genocide. These people were deliberately killed off to take over. And at that time, especially under Andrew Jackson's time and right around Bartram's time, there was a belief called manifest destiny, that if these Indians have died off from these diseases and from these smallpox and syphilis and slave raids that were taking place, God must have made it possible for us Christians by divine right to clear the land of these pagans so we can take this land over. This is God's providence. It's manifest destiny. That's not the case at all. These people had a way of life. They had a belief system. And according to many of the people of the time, the early explorers would say that these Indians were honoring the thunder god, the sun god, the underworld god. They got it wrong. The Indians were honoring the power behind that stuff. And they called, amongst the Seminoles and Creeks, they called the one God, the supreme being, Breathmaker. He gave us life. He gave us life. And we have these symbols of all these different things in life to explain the story of what Creator has done for us, what He has given us to survive on this land. Because we only have a short time. And these Indians always had a belief system. And if the Catholics and the early missions would have changed things a little bit and listened better, we'd have a lot more Indians today. But we've lost many nations. The Timucua that were here in Florida are gone. They are no longer existent. The language is gone. And but we have traditions of Indians that lived in the Southeast just like them, the Creek, the Seminole, the Choctaw. But for the grace of all things, the Seminoles are here, and they have casinos, and they're buying back Florida. So hopefully things will change and get better to put money into preserving our past, preserving our history. And so going and moving forward here, I didn't paint too many scenes of early pre-Columbian Indians. I mean, I did paint many, but I didn't want to get into historical scenes that involved involvement of the white man. I wanted to paint Indians because I felt that the contact, once the white man entered the Indian world, it was over. Their world went to hell in a handbag. You know, they were decimated. They were killed off. And my spirit at that time in the 90s and early 2000s, I didn't want to paint that imagery because I didn't want to honor it. As I learned more on the history of Florida and early archaeology, everywhere I looked, the word William Bartram came up. This person, William Bartram. And I looked at his drawings, and they were kind of fanciful, but it wasn't until 2003 that I started reading the travels. And when I read them travels, a couple times, it sunk into me the human being that was William Bartram. And if you know anything about modern people today, artists are not normal people. We are different. We are strange. Bartram was strange. Bartram was very strange. But he was talented beyond belief. He had a vision that was like no other at that time, and that's why he got to the places he was in the positions, through his talent and his grace to see the beauty of the creation through God and the gift to us all, for all of us to enjoy. He saw things that we will never see again, and some things that are still here in Florida that we will continue to see. I'm looking for an image here that this is a typical cypress tree around 1875 in Florida. Most of those are gone. There's hardly any of these existent. Now, up around the Altamaha River, the Ogeechee River, there is a few strands of cypress trees that are that big. The Senator that used to be in the Ocala National Forest was burned down by, not necessarily deliberate, but it was a pretty tragic accident by some kids sitting there burning cigarettes, and they threw a cigarette into this hole of that Senator, and they burned it to the ground 3 years ago. They're in jail. They are in jail because they were partying, and they ruined. But this is a typical, and Bartram, when he came into this area, he saw trees that were huge like this. And as he's canoeing through these areas, especially along the St. Johns River, The trees reminded him of the cathedrals and the churches because they were like spires that reached into the heavens. And if you read some of his passages, he speaks about, amongst nature, this godless kingdom of outside world is not a place of darkness and fear. It is a place of God. This is God's creation. He saw these trees that reach the heavens, and anything that can get that close to God is greater than I. It is just, and he responded to that, and he responded to all things that we all love about Florida, the beauty, the natural, and the Indians. He was accepted amongst his Indians in a way that I wish I was, and in a way maybe I have been. But it was a great honor when the tribal people said, "For a white boy, you paint our people well." And I was honored by that, because she meant seriously that was very true. Because Indians have the right to be sort of secretive about their, because they've been so left behind and misinterpreted and put into museums as if they were specimens and not people, that they're very careful to let go of intellectual information since Bartram, because they've seen everything they've known and loved taken and destroyed and ruined. Even the game of the forest. Under Bartram's time, when Panton and Leslie were here discussing all the, or doing business among the Indians, make no mistake, part of their work to do was to make sure they got whiskey and guns. The British made sure of this. Give them whiskey and guns, they will be a bunch of hoodlums and intolerable indigenous people that are not to be trusted. They will kill themselves in the woods. And they basically did. They will hunt everything out to bring those skins back to get more whiskey. Because the Europeans knew, you give an Indian whiskey, he's gone. So the Indians would bring back and hunt out, certain groups would, and this was the problem that caused the Creek War, that traditional Creeks were saying, you've got to stop providing the white man with all this stuff. You're killing everything you see for the sickness of greed just to get another drink of whiskey. And the Indians said, we can do what we want. And they took the side of the British and continued to trade with that. They were also finding out that their resources were dwindling. Their land was dwindling. They were getting squeezed out. There was not much game left. The skins of deer that were brought into the Panton and Leslie would stack to the ceiling in this one building alone. There were several buildings from Pensacola, Alabama, here to Stallings Island, and a remarkable, the Spalding store, of a trade store, and the Indians were bringing in buckskins. The word bucks, I'll give you $10, I'll give you $5, came as a result here in Florida of the Indians bringing in to Panton and Leslie's store $50. And they were given money, not so much money, but they were given goods. For $50, you get this. So that's where we get the term bucks. And that's quite an interesting thing. Again, Bartram was there. He saw a lot of that stuff. He shook his head in awe, I'm sure of it. That's why he was a loner. I understand. You see things going on in this world that just make you sick, and you just want to see the beauty of everything. And as an artist, why do I paint the past? Why do I paint history? Why do I paint just pretty pictures of Florida? Because many things in our world are so ugly that I can't stand to look at it anymore. I have to paint what's beautiful, what I knew what was. Because there is still beauty here. We've got to connect with it. We've got to reconnect to our past. We've got to reconnect to our present, so we will know where we're going in the future. Because if we don't know where we've been, we don't know where we're going. And that's one of the greater things about art. Yeah, I'm getting ready to go to it. I'm working my way to it. Exit. I've done many murals. One of the first murals I've done in Florida was for Lake Placid. And it's called the Lost in Time. And it's a mural that is 100 and... Come on. Straight away. There we are. Got a cup of tea. Get it going. There we go. It's a mural. It's huge. It dwarfs our mural here and the Bartram mural, but it's one of my early murals. It's kind of stiff and archaic, but it shows 3 different distinct time periods of Florida. 12,000 years ago, the early Indians using a Clovis point, like the one I found, hunting mastodons on a Florida that is not like what we see today. It was grassy savannas like the Serengeti Plain of Africa. Little hammocks with little water holes in it that had animals gathered around it. And from each hammock to another, a small stream connected it. Today, those small streams are now the Santa Fe River, the Suwannee River, the St. Johns River, and these hammocks all connected, and those hammocks are now the highland cities of Orlando, of Jacksonville, Calford, Small cities that we know today were actually hammocks of high ground along the riverbanks in Florida, and it's on the water which connects people. So the mural shows a 12,000 years ago scene. Fast forward to about 3,000 years ago when Indians developed the bow and arrow. They were using a spear and atlatl before then. They developed the bow and arrow, and they're hunting deer. This would be the same site, but look how much more forest ameliorated. After the Ice Age ended, Florida became much wetter. A great flood occurred, which owes homage to our Bible, that we incurred a huge wet period through the earth. And it's probably right about the time of Noah, when a great flood had covered the earth, and there was great tribulations on the earth. There is evidence of Florida being covered with water and up again and down again, but at this time, Florida became almost submerged again. There was so much rain and so much activity. The Ice Age was melting the ice that used to cover as far south as North Carolina. As that ice melted rapidly, the waters flew and the climate changed. There was a lot of rain. It developed into what we call the Archaic period. About 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, Florida became wetter. There was much more rain, and growth occurred. Seeds, the animals, the large animals that grazed along these prairies had died out either by climate change or overhunting. But anyway, Florida became more forested, but the people had moved in here for 1,000 years. They adapted to the environment. That was a natural progression. This wasn't caused a climate change by chemicals flowing in the air, or mass induction of resources being depleted. They adapted over time, and they adapted wonderfully. And then the very last mural of this panel shows an archaeologist digging in a hole of all this history, from pottery to shell material to mammoth bones, and then the spirit of an Indian is down looking over the archaeologist. So it's called the Lost in Time, Spirit of Time. On the top is a large arrow which spans across the mural. I love symbology. And this arrow right here, there are dates on it. This is 10,000 years ago. And over time, the very tip of that arrow, the very tip of the stone's point is today. All the rest of this time period shows how long Native Americans have been here occupying as Native Americans. And our culture ain't nothing compared to the Indian way. We are a speck of dirt on an immense beach of time of people and culture in Florida. And look what we've done to this land in 100 years, in 200 years. We have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn. So murals are a fantastic way to get a big picture and a big scene, like a movie, to many people. And I found it to be wonderful because it helped people to see something they never saw. When I got the first opportunity to do the Bartram mural, I was approached by Bill Snyder, who was the president of the Conley Snyder Mural Society. And this was about 20 years ago, and he wanted me to paint a couple subject matters that I wasn't interested in the Jazz Age. I wanted to paint Indians. And old Bill said, well, I have Indian scenes already. We need this jazz. I said, I don't want to do it. Well, we'd love to have something done, but we'll get back with you. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 6, 10, 20 years went by. Finally, I was connected by his son, Bill Snyder, Jr. Awesome guy. I surfed with him for years. And we always talk about the mural, but hey, this is a slow town. It's a quiet town. They move slow. But time takes time. Just ask the Ice Age. So I got the commission to do this mural, and I came up with an idea, and they wanted Bartram. And by that time, I had learned a lot about Bartram. And to do that mural was a godsend. It's one of the highlights of my career to be able to do this mural for Palatka. And this is, come along, we'll make it bigger. That's kind of digitized, but you've all seen the mural. We get the idea. There was 1,000 things I could have done, but I wanted to capture what Bartram was and what he did and how he got here. He came in a boat, a pirogue. I didn't have much photographic reference for a good pirogue, so I did the best I could. That looks more like a skiff from a modern yacht, but in the small tidal inlets and the creeks that fed into it, there were high ground hamlets that the Indians would make their villages upon. And so I've got this scene here of a Seminole village, and Bartram has spent the night with the Indians. He's leaving the creek, and all the Indians are gathered on the shore. Goodbye, Puckpuggy, goodbye. They gave him the name Puckpuggy, which means the flower hunter. And they admired him greatly. Even Cuscawilla the long warrior, was in great admiration of Bartram because he didn't come to give them whiskey. He didn't come to take a gun. He didn't come to give them a gun. He didn't come to do a trade for land. He didn't want to come to cheat them or nothing. He wanted to know about their world. And if anybody knows about the world, it's the people who live on the land, the old timers. You want to know about Florida? You go ask a family that's been here for a while. Don't ask any of your representatives because they don't care. They don't care. Ask Governor Scott about what the early archaic period of Florida is. Ask Governor Scott if he knows anything about Weed and Island period cultures in Florida. Ask him if he knows about the historic transition from Timucua to the Appalachee mission trip. But you ask an old Florida cracker about Florida history? Well, my granddad used to argue with Pedro Menendez. It's true. These people have a history that goes back, and they may not have the facts straight, but they have the spirit straight because they can smell an arrowhead in the ground. They can smell a gator. They can smell a duck. 10 more minutes. Okay. So this mural shows all the things that he encountered. Large alligators, the birds, the Indians, magnolia trees. Up in the Altamaha River, he had found with his father some 10, 20 years earlier, the Franklininius altamahas. It had been there all along. It wasn't lost, but they came across, it was beautiful. So they named it after their friend, Benjamin Franklin. And that plant is almost extinct today. There might be a few distinct hybrid relatives of it today, but basically that plant is extinct because of so much activity that's taken place with the paper mills and the lumbering and the milling along the Georgia coast. But Bartram did remarkable things here. And one of the great honors of being at this event, finally, after being an archaeological artist for almost 30 years, and then discovering Bartram almost 15 years ago, I came to St. Augustine in 2006 and wanted to do a Bartram play. I had written a play. I became William Bartram, the artist, and I moved from Thomasville, Georgia after my divorce, living on the Gulf Coast, got recovery of my whole spiritual life up in Thomasville, Georgia. Thank God for Georgia. Also went to school there. Go Gators, or dogs. Boo! When I'm dead from being stoned, my work will be worth lots of money. But I'm also a Gator fan and an old fan. What do you expect? I like Southern teams. But when I come and see these drawings, it is just so neat to see them this close. These are copies that are so good and real, I can almost see his pencil lines. I can see where he was probably sitting down drawing and covering it. And don't copy me. He was so into it, But that is a personal expression when he said. So I took these drawings and I put them at the top of the mural. Even the fanciful gators up there, which look as if they're blowing smoke, it's mist. It's water mist. And have you ever seen a gator in a hole, a bull gator, humping his back and blowing that water? There's nothing scarier or more awesome. Bartram saw this. The encountering of rattlesnakes and whatnot. He had so much trouble dealing with rattlesnakes. Not so much in his trail, but he knew they were there. But the Indians were so entertained at his agility to go in there and take care of it. So when he was staying with a cow killer or cow keeper over in Gainesville area of Paynes Prairie, he was bothered while he was in his tent doing his drawings. And the Indians come up, let's get Pug Buddy. And they brought up, we got another snake. All right, I'll kill it. All night long they kept coming to him. He's like, what? He was tired of chasing them down, but he knew he was great entertainment to these people. And he did it. He did it. And the Indians saw, this guy has patience. Well, if a Quaker, you better have patience. But he wasn't quaking. He was probably laughing at it. He wrote this down in his journal. He kept this journal alive. It became an inspiration so big that his writing, some 30 years later, in Europe, was a bestseller. It inspired Coleridge and Wadsworth to write Kubla Khan for the trees that he saw in Florida, those cypress trees that take 6 men to go around it. He was seeing these trees that touch the heavens, swamp so clear you could see the bottom of the ground, which is 90 feet down, alligators and dragons and reptiles and strange people, the Indians. It inspired Europe's people that had never seen it because Europe at that time was so overpopulated. Filth ran in the streets, revolutions were going on, people were being beheaded, there was Black Plague, there was typhoid, you name it, it was filthy over there. To read William Bartram's travels in Europe was a breath of fresh air. And I think the bulk of Bartram's travel, the best spiritual part of Bartram's travels was right here in Florida, right here in Palatka. Palatka. Best ever. It's a story that's remarkable. So I had this little itty itty bitty wall to cram all this stuff into it. And when I started the mural, and where am I going to stay? We started this mural on a whim. Okay, get over here. And Bill Snyder got me here. We had no paint. We had to drive all the way to Orlando down 1792 because Bill likes the slow way there. He will take you down every country, and it was awesome. But it took us 2 days to drive down there and back in the bus, going 10 miles an hour, in the left lane with the right blinker on. That's Bill. God love him. You got to surf with him. He's awesome. And we had a ball. And we went down, got the paint. I couldn't wait to get started. Where am I going to stay? You can stay in my tent. You can say, no. Guess what? Linda Kreider says you can stay at her house because she's up in Alaska. Alaska? Well, it was so hot, I know now why she was there. I know why she was there. I was there in August on the street starting a mural. I damn near expired. It was so hot. I got done with that mural every day, and I'd go into that house, and she had a music room. Oh, it was horrible. It was horrible. I found peace in Palatka. It was just awesome. But the first day I started it, I started the wall, I started the sky, I did all of the sky, and I started that background, and I started the water, and I started Scomism, but it was finally, I started at sunrise. By 1 o'clock, I just had the background done, just the sky, and I went back to Linda's house to make a sandwich, and a thunderstorm broke out. No big deal. So I rode my bike down the hill again, back to the mural, and the whole mural, and it went down the sidewalk, through the ditch, down the St. Johns River, and down to the creek. There was a blue and purple slick on the river, all the way to the dock. Non-toxic water-based paint, but I sat there like this, like Bugs Bunny. And the cop goes, "Quigley, are you on something?" I said, "No, my mural just washed down the drain." So I painted at night. I learned my lesson. Palatka, it rains at 1, it rains at 11, it rains at 10, it rains at 4. After 5, it don't rain no more. And I learned also that's when this town comes alive. After dark, nobody's here. The Indians partied at night here in Palatka. Bartram did his best writing early in the morning. Guess when everybody went to bed. At night, the Indians were partying. So I probably have to wrap this up here. What, I got like 5 more minutes? Okay. This mural was a highlight of my career. At the same time, this was August 2000. The next month was the 450th birthday party for St. Augustine. A celebration of 450 years of the oldest, longest, continuous occupied European city in the United States. By the time Plymouth Rock was established, St. Augustine had urban renewal problems. They've been burned down 3 times, big time. They had 12 taverns. Woo! St. Augustine is now a drinking town with a history problem. Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. But I was commissioned after this refreshing Bartram mural for the mural I've been working on for 6 months. And I got weekend furloughs to do the Bartram mural. I got weekend furloughs from the city to do this mural for St. Augustine's 450th. And it's called El Llegado de Pedro Menendez. And in the last 5 years, or last 10 years, I've done a lot more historic paintings. I want to show you the image of everything that is connected with 450 years of history. Let me look in the computer. It's easier. Da-da-da. I wish I could show everything in here and tell you more, but I'll be glad to. I have on the back walls here displays of my work. I have limited edition prints. And as a minor in archaeology, I still like to collect at random archaeological sites, salvage work, watching the bulldozers and the dump trucks. I have a selection of 3 prints with actual artifacts recovered from archaeological sites. And that material is found as isolated finds. And what I do with it, it helps fund me to do what I'm doing. I'm not looting sites. I'm not claiming to be an archivist, but I'm finding stuff in the bulldozer's trail and using it to promote my ongoing research for archaeology that helps me to do these paintings. Without archaeology, I cannot do these paintings. Archaeology isn't about finding a thing and putting it in your pocket and putting it on for sale for display. Archaeology is a precise method of taking back layers of soil to read the past. The past are pages of stories. Bartram wrote a book called The Travels, which is a remarkable archaeological, anthropological, environmental study of Florida. Nothing like it. And that is an archaeological treasure right there. And you can read it, you can hold it. And all that is based on archaeology. Even the Bartram mural is based on archaeology. Looking for my mural. Call number 6 on the air. Paging Dr. Bombay. There. No. Da-da-da. Now, I keep saying, I love reenactments. And when I'm dead, my work's going to be worth a lot of money. And I got killed 3 times by the British Army at the invasion of Searles Raiding. And when they killed me, the audience clapped. I was so loud and obnoxious because I'm going, Muerte de Inglaterra! You virgin queen should die! You know, I was obnoxious. And finally they killed me, and the audience clapped. I had a lot of fun. I'm obnoxious, so I'm an artist. What do you expect? This is the mural I did for the City of St. Augustine's 450th. This has all my reenactor friends in it. It has all my people. Right here sits Patty Rang. I took a photograph of her at another camp, and there she's sitting there spinning yarns. Actually, she's spinning and doing some sewing, but when that woman talks, I listen, because she knows everything about details and history. It took me years to earn her respect, and she's like the Dalai Lama of historical reenactment. This is a couple friends of mine, the Alvarezes. These are all friends of mine back here in the background. Right here, let me see if I can get close to it. The detail isn't good, but this mural is 14 feet long by 6 feet high. This this European woman is standing here. She's wearing a blue dress with an orange vest and a white top, and a little Indian boy is handing her an alligator. That's Kathy Deegan, her first induction into Gatorland. That's Dr. Kathy Deegan. Back here is Carl Harbert, and he's got a shovel, and he's got his white hair. He's an old hippie, and he's been there all this time. And he's digging a hole to put in the well. As a salvage archaeologist, the best place for an archaeologist to dig is the trash pits. And there he is in the background. I wish the details were better. He's in the hole digging a well for the water, and that's where all the best archaeology is found. So this painting shows Siloy greeting Menendez, and Menendez is saying, I promised you unto God as a Knight of Santiago that I will keep my word. And he did. He didn't do that. It was the Catholic Church that did all that. The Jesuit priests had brought in so much disaster to the Indians. But the very first meeting was remarkable. With Menendez came a freed Moroccan black man. He was a free man. He was one of the soldiers. And the Indians are coming up to him, touching his clothes. It'd be like you and me sitting watching TV and a UFO pulled up in the driveway. Honey, what's that? I don't know. And they get him out of the ship. I'd be up there touching them and look. That's what this Indian was. She's looking at these olives that he has in his jar. And this Indian here is going, give me a bite. And the little girl, Mom left her aside. She said, I'm going to try these olives, you know. She's looking at this black, and they were fascinated with the black man because he had black skin. That was amazing to them. They called the Spaniards bearded dogs because they were short and small. And they were speaking Spanish, and it sounded like they were barking. And one last thing I want to show here. This is one of the things I like to do as an artist. This was still when the mural wasn't finished. Back in the background, I like to hide things in my mural. There's nothing hidden in the Bartram mural because this is such a huge public thing. But things that are hidden in a painting that have a subject. Right down here, if you look at the original painting, which hangs downtown at St. Augustine Museum, there's a chest. And these are musicians. That's where the party is. If you want to find the party, follow the music. So I've got musicians in the background. They're playing a lute, a couple drums, and a trumpet. They're playing Stairway to Heaven, or Spanish music. Right here on the chest, right down there, is a Heineken beer bottle. That will throw the archaeologists off. And it's just for fun. No one would know it. And this is one of the few people I've told them myself. So, what is good art without scandal? Bartram had his scandals. I had mine. He had his issues. And at one time when his plantation failed, he let his slaves go that his father bought for him. I don't blame him. Let them go. These are human beings. These are my brothers. I will not endorse this. He took on a project so big to farm indigo, he couldn't do it. I took on things in life that I had no business doing, and I failed miserably. I went into a hole so bad, to a point where even my friends, like Dr. Fothergill, said, poor Billy is in such a state that no spirit of man could take him. Mr. Bartram, I do recommend that you come and get your son. And John Bartram came and got his son, recovered him, and almost 10 years later, Bartram was commissioned to come to do his travels and do this thing. And like an artist that I am, I recognize Bartram the artist. I recognize Bartram the struggling artist. I recognize the spiritual side. Our reenactor, Mr. Adams here, is fantastic with his energy and his passion for it, especially his intellectual side. I am no intellectual. I'm a passionate, emotional mess, but I can make a good picture. And that's it. Thank you.
I must say, that's a tough act to follow. Yep, Dean Quigley's been all over the place, and he's renowned in this area, and he's quite a wonderful resource for our state.
Thank you.
I must say, I've been following his artwork for years, and it is pretty amazing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to close here this afternoon and give you a big thank you for coming out to this event today. As Sam Carr was saying, the mastermind behind this event, we hope to make this an annual event, so look forward to it every fall. And keep your eyes peeled and tell your friends and relatives and anybody else that would be interested in the natural world here in Putnam County and the St. Johns River and history, art, science. It's all covered under William Bartram. A couple other things I'd like to thank Ken and Janice back here. Boy, did they do a good job on those stacks.
Woo! Yeah, I'm a carving artist.
Setting up this room. This doesn't happen by itself. So thank them on your way out, and check out Dean's artwork there. I'm sure there's a very reasonable price tag on those, and it goes to a wonderful cause. And once again, if you haven't read my book, The Travels of William Bartram, take a look and see what you think, and move on from there. Very good. Thanks for coming out, and we'll see you next year.